What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 13. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. The First Continental Army is overjoyed to be of service to Her Highness, Princess AZULA. Hua and Shou knelt and saluted in unison on the grasslands just off the main trade road, and the rest of their army behind them echoed the gesture. Before them, Princess AZULA stood with a satisfied smile, while Prince Xing behind her wore a knowing smirk. It was like a ceremonial parade meeting between two army groups, like the changing of the guard or the induction of a new batch of recruits. Rise. It is I who should be grateful to have the loyalty of such loyal warriors. To the soft gasps of many soldiers, the princess bowed deeply before them. Even as a performance, it was a powerful gesture. Even Prince Iroh, back in his days as a gregarious and much beloved general, kept some royal distance from the common soldier. Here, the princess brought her head lower than her salute, diminishing her status before the army. Then again, Hua probably didn't have her family's lives drastically improved as some of the troops had experienced. She'd not witnessed her family fortunes reversed from impoverished obscurity, nor was she a colonist or refugee whose life was raised to rival the comforts of the home islands. The soldiers were concerned because they owed their lives to her, quite literally in many cases. To these people, loyalty to the princess was a given thing, taken as much as granted as breathing. For everyone else, Hua included, Princess AZULA's accomplishments and conduct was enough to keep them with the First Continental Army, or they were simply loyal to Xing, like Shou. It amounted to the same thing. And on that note, Xing neatly cut in and stepped forwards. It's come to our attention that the invaders from home islands have been far from compassionate in their so-called mission to restore order in the colonies. Hua's eyes widened as the bedraggled and bound figure of High General Bujing was pushed up to the front, similarly bound men following after him. Princess AZULA immediately fell into a scowl as she turned to the prisoners, while Xing raised his voice to address the First Continental Army. High General Bujing has led his armies on a heartless march through many villages and towns. From the confessions we've taken so far, Wuzhai, Seiro, Nairang, and other such settlements along the West Lake were sacked. The civilians that fled too late were tortured for cruel amusement before being massacred. General Hua immediately felt the cold hostility from her soldiers behind her washing past her. How many of these people might have friends or family in those regions? Probably not a lot, as the regiments and grand battalions under the First Continental Army mostly drew any colonial manpower from the proper colonies up until the Civil War. Still, it was another slap to the face for any colonist from the callous fools of the home islands. Now, under the law set by Princess AZULA, while she served as colonial minister, such wanton carnage would be punished most heavily, whether the perpetrators be noble or commoner, colonist, or from the home islands. But with her removal from said post by the Fire Lord, the colonial territories have reverted back to its old laws. The old laws meant nobles could, with varying degrees of spending, suffer at worst royal chastisement and some fines, just like what they'd face back in the home islands. Except that the lives of colonists and conquered Earth Kingdom natives were likely much cheaper to earn a slap on the wrist. Now, while Princess AZULA holds no official authority some soldiers immediately protested in outrage. Princess AZULA rules the colonies. The territories of the continent belong to Princess AZULA. Xing let the protest carry on for a few seconds before casually waving a hand to regain silence. He gave a lazy turn of his head towards the princess, who took a step forwards to stand beside him and address the agitated crowd. I am moved by your loyalty, but I cannot call myself ruler of the colonies. The colonies as we know it are mostly gone. Its people now under the protection of Boss Sing Se. Those that remain are shackled by the home island invaders. Even after all this is done, after I've brought my father and his lackeys to justice. There might be little reason to rebuild the ruins, as the Earth Kingdom comes to retake what they see as theirs. The soldiers seemed ready to protest again, but Princess AZULA raised both hands placatingly. However, I am soon to be the princess of Ba Sing Se. My most loyal prince, Xing, has already promised to resettle the refugees and offer them a new home. Offer me a new home. It is an offer I have accepted, so that I can continue ensuring the well-being of those who place their trust in me. There is still much room in that great city. It is my hope that we can all create a new home in Ba Sing Se, together. Relocating to Ba Sing Se? That sounded, well, not exactly ambitious, but bold. Settling in the conquered capital city-state sent a strong message to both the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Wa found she rather liked the idea of moving there with Shou. Maybe they could get some dispensation from the young prince and princess to be removed from Ba Sing Se's political scene, so they could enjoy a peaceful retirement away from family and court life. Many officers and common soldiers alike seemed to share the sentiment, as they cheered their approval at the princess. Said princess silenced the crowd with a laconic wave of her hands. Prince Xing has most kindly granted me now the responsibilities and powers I will soon gain. I might not be colonial minister, nor wield the full authority of the Fire Nation, but I can charge these pillagers, these raiders, as Princess of Ba Sing Se. What say you? The cheers were a roaring din this time, further solidifying Princess AZULA's legitimacy as Princess of Ba Sing Se. It was a masterful stroke, as the princess' usual standard. Princess AZULA waited for the roars to quiet down before turning to the prisoners. Well then, with the powers vested to me as ruler of Ba Sing Se, for the crimes of encouraging raiding and preying on the innocent, I hereby sentence you lot dash, you promised leniency. One of the prisoners interrupted, which was a cry quickly echoed by his fellows. We've done as you asked. Have you no honor? That is true, Xing spoke up, drawing their desperate attention to him. I did promise that Ba Sing Se will not harm you in exchange for your cooperation. Wa saw the flicker of hope flare to life in the prisoners, except for High General Bujing. At the same time, annoyance bubbled from the men behind her. Xing made a show of turning to her and Shou. General Shou, General Wa. Your army isn't pledged to me, is it? No, Prince Xing, Shou immediately answered. We've rebelled to support the princess, but that doesn't mean the First Continental Army is aligned with Ba Sing Se. Yet, the flames of hope were cruelly snuffed as the bound commanders realized what would follow. Well then, is there anything I can do to persuade you to join me, as your princess has done? Shou played along and glanced over his shoulder to his troops for a second, and then glanced back at Xing. Perhaps we might be convinced if we were allowed to dispense justice. Xing turned to Princess AZULA with a lazy smile. What say you, my princess? Her smile matched his. As Princess of Ba Sing Se, I hereby extradite you prisoners to the care of the rebels of the First Continental Army. Defeat tinged the captured commanders' pleas for mercy, but Dao led a few men to drag them back. Colonel Dao. Yeah. The oaf paused and turned to Xing with a puzzled frown just as the prisoners were exchanged. The prince wore a surprisingly somber expression. That serving girl that you sponsored? Shufang. She was with her family in Wuzhai when Bujing's army hit. We found her. He walked up and offered a small pouch to Dao, whose eyes were now wide with shock. His hands actually trembled as they gingerly received Xing's item, and heavy silence filled the air as the massive man, normally a loud and bloodthirsty brute, quietly opened the pouch to peer at the contents within. My condolences. The pouch dropped from Dao's meaty hand, spilling out a simple silver necklace and a small string bracelet, more like an oversized ring actually. Shufang. Dao looked up to stare emptily at Xing, who gave a slow, regretful shake of his head. One knew things were taking a dark turn when Shou subtly nudged her back a few steps. The other officers also shuffled back, making space between Dao and the prisoners, even as the troops escorting the prisoners hastily ran off and abandoned escorting the bound men. Even Xing's side were uncomfortably making some space, with only the scorpion remaining rooted on the spot. Sayufang. Dao's thunderous roar startled Wa and many others. Flames burst out from the colonel as he turned to the closest prisoner. The hapless commander didn't get a chance to scream as Dao's hands quickly wrapped around his neck and pulled. With a sickening crack and squelch, the man's head was ripped free from his neck, and Dao kept roaring even as the fountain of blood sprayed him right in the face. Shufang. He charged at another prisoner, and the new victim fell over as he tried to flee with his ankles still bound. Dao stomped on the man's back, visibly deforming the poor man's chest as spine and ribs broke. And the great thunder continued stomping, roaring in insensate rage as blood stained the prisoner's silk robes, and bones tore through the attire. Shou placed a comforting hand on Hua, drawing her attention from the grisly scene. Best to let him grieve. I'll have the army reorganize with Xing's people. Hua could only nod and watch as her husband gave the orders to the colonels, who were all doing their best to ignore the sorrowful roars and the sick cracking of bone and flesh. She too tried not to glance at Dao's way, nor the screaming prisoners who were trying to drag themselves out of his reach. A gesture from Shou had some men gingerly pushing back the prisoners towards the storm of rage. Whatever justice Princess AZULA or the troops might have had in mind, the prisoners' fates now likely far exceeded their imagination. Leaving Dao to wreak bloody vengeance, Hua followed Shou to meet with Xing and Princess AZULA at a more comfortable and distant location. This time, the salute Shou offered was far less formal. Sad business, that. Xing gave a single nod. Dao will be blaming himself for not taking her in, or sending her to Boss Sing Se. I'll have to see that he doesn't drown himself in drink, her husband sighed. Probably best to keep him from the front lines unless you don't want prisoners. This is not the first time, I take it, the princess asked with a half-worried look. Xing shook his head ruefully. Fourth, though it's the first to suffer from the Fire Nation. Dao might be too free in giving in to his passions, but he truly does care for those that catch his eye. Shou nodded gravely. It's quite a while ago since he lost a mistress. Koda had to throw his cavalry in to stop Dao from rampaging by himself the last time it happened. We didn't manage to keep many prisoners in that battle, and the stores of wine were emptied out in the course of 3 nights after that, Xing added. We had to burn his tent and some of his belongings because of how stained they ended up being. If he falls into such a state, why tell him now? Princess AZULA asked, looking truly appalled. Both Xing and Shou shrugged. He'll find out eventually, the prince answered. He writes to his mistresses frequently. All of them. And sometimes he forgets to remind them he's on campaign. And their replies return to his estate, to be read by his wife. Hence Lady Dao's constant state of wrath at her husband. Better to tell him now than to have him find out later, Shou added. Who knows where he'll be when that happens, and what kind of carnage he'll leave in his wake. Trying to stop him will only make you a target. Even Li Dai kept clear of Dao rather than trying to calm him down the second time it happened. It felt a little dirty weaponizing Dao's grief, but Hua had to agree with her husband. If this sort of rage was unleashed at the wrong time, in a town on the home islands, for example, the damage might be horrendous. If it cannot be helped, Princess AZULA began to say, waiting for earnest nods from Xing and Shou before continuing. Then we have no choice but to leave Colonel Dao to get it out of his system, and move on to other matters. Agreed, Your Highness, Hua said, just a fraction of a second before her husband. The young royals and the married generals assembled their subordinates to plan the next stages of the counterattack, hashing out the objectives they needed to hit. With the bulk of the punitive force broken, they could afford splitting up to retake the coast and pushing back the foothold from the home island loyalists. The first priority, however, was to hit the nearest enemy port to capture some ships, which allowed Xing and the princess to launch a counter-invasion. It had to be done in a hurry, and Hua found herself shuddering with distaste along with many others as Xing briefed them on the day of Black Sunday. Further details were hashed out, as well as the reorganization from the reintegration of the 1st Continental Army into Boss Sing Se. All officers from both parties kept fully focused on the planning, ignoring the muted roars in the background. Once the task was done, Hua took her husband aside for a brief private talk. I think it's best you tell me what other latent issues your friends might have, so I can prepare myself. Shou gave a chuckle. I think Dao about covers it. Unless you have a pretty brother, then best to keep him away from Koda. What? Shou placed a gentle hand on her shoulders as he led her back to their camp. Right, I forgot to tell you. You know how Koda is a bit overindulgent with his messenger boys. The 1st Continental Army is overjoyed to be of service to Her Highness, Princess AZULA. Hua and Shou knelt and saluted in unison on the grasslands just off the main trade road, and the rest of their army behind them echoed the gesture. Before them, Princess AZULA stood with a satisfied smile, while Prince Xing behind her wore a knowing smirk. It was like a ceremonial parade meeting between 2 army groups, like the changing of the guard or the induction of a new batch of recruits. Rise. It is I who should be grateful to have the loyalty of such loyal warriors. To the soft gasps of many soldiers, the princess bowed deeply before them. Even as a performance, it was a powerful gesture. Even Prince Iroh, back in his days as a gregarious and much beloved general, kept some royal distance from the common soldier. Here, the princess brought her head lower than her salute, diminishing her status before the army. Then again, while probably didn't have her family's lives drastically improved as some of the troops had experienced, she'd not witnessed her family fortunes reversed from impoverished obscurity. Nor was she a colonist or refugee whose life was raised to rival the comforts of the home islands. The soldiers were concerned because they owed their lives to her, quite literally in many cases. To these people, loyalty to the princess was a given thing, taken as much as granted as breathing. For everyone else, Wa included, Princess AZULA's accomplishments and conduct was enough to keep them with the First Continental Army. Or they were simply loyal to Xing, like Shou. It amounted to the same thing. And on that note, Xing neatly cut in and stepped forwards. It's come to our attention that the invaders from home islands have been far from compassionate in their so-called mission to restore order in the colonies. Wa's eyes widened as the bedraggled and bound figure of High General Bujing was pushed up to the front, similarly bound men following after him. Princess AZULA immediately fell into a scowl as she turned to the prisoners, while Xing raised his voice to address the First Continental Army. High General Bujing has led his armies on a heartless march through many villages and towns. From the confessions we've taken so far, Wuzhai, Seiro, Nairang, and other such settlements along the West Lake were sacked. The civilians that fled too late were tortured for cruel amusement before being massacred. General Wa immediately felt the cold hostility from her soldiers behind her washing past her. How many of these people might have friends or family in those regions? Probably not a lot, as the regiments and grand battalions under the First Continental Army mostly drew any colonial manpower from the proper colonies up until the Civil War. Still, it was another slap to the face for any colonist from the callous fools of the home islands. Now, under the law set by Princess AZULA while she served as colonial minister, such wanton carnage would be punished most heavily, whether the perpetrators be noble or commoner, colonist or from the home islands. But with her removal from said post by the Fire Lord, the colonial territories have reverted back to its old laws. The old laws meant nobles could, with varying degrees of spending, suffer at worst royal chastisement and some fines, just like what they'd face back in the home islands. Except that the lives of colonists and conquered Earth Kingdom natives were likely much cheaper to earn a slap on the wrist. Now, while Princess AZULA holds no official authority no, some soldiers immediately protested in outrage. Princess AZULA rules the colonies. The territories of the continent belong to Princess AZULA. Xing let the protest carry on for a few seconds before casually waving a hand to regain silence. He gave a lazy turn of his head towards the princess, who took a step forwards to stand beside him and address the agitated crowd. I am moved by your loyalty, but I cannot call myself ruler of the colonies. The colonies as we know it are mostly gone. Its people now under the protection of Omni-sensei. Those that remain are shackled by the home island invaders. Even after all this is done, after I've brought my father and his lackeys to justice, there might be little reason to rebuild the ruins as the Earth Kingdom comes to retake what they see as theirs. The soldiers seemed ready to protest again, but Princess AZULA raised both hands placatingly. However, I am soon to be the princess of Omni-sensei. My most loyal prince, Xing, has already promised to resettle the refugees and offer them a new home. Offer me a new home. It is an offer I have accepted, so that I can continue ensuring the well-being of those who place their trust in me. There is still much room in that great city. It is my hope that we can all create a new home in Omni-sensei, together. Relocating to Omni-sensei? That sounded, well, not exactly ambitious, but bold. Settling in the conquered capital city-state sent a strong message to both the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Wa found she rather liked the idea of moving there with Shou. Maybe they could get some dispensation from the young prince and princess to be removed from Omni-sensei's political scene, so they could enjoy a peaceful retirement away from family and court life. Many officers and common soldiers alike seemed to share the sentiment, as they cheered their approval at the princess. Said princess silenced the crowd with a laconic wave of her hands. Prince Xing has most kindly granted me now the responsibilities and powers I will soon gain. I might not be colonial minister, nor wield the full authority of the Fire Nation, but I can charge these pillagers, these raiders, as Princess of Ba Sing Se. What say you? The cheers were a roaring din this time, further solidifying Princess AZULA's legitimacy as Princess of Ba Sing Se. It was a masterful stroke, as the princess' usual standard. Princess AZULA waited for the roars to quiet down before turning to the prisoners. Well then, with the powers vested to me as ruler of Ba Sing Se, for the crimes of encouraging raiding and preying on the innocent, I hereby sentence you lot dash, you promised leniency. One of the prisoners interrupted, which was a cry quickly echoed by his fellows. We've done as you asked. Have you no honor? That is true, Xing spoke up, drawing their desperate attention to him. I did promise that Ba Sing Se will not harm you in exchange for your cooperation. Hua saw the flicker of hope flare to life in the prisoners, except for High General Bujing. At the same time, annoyance bubbled from the men behind her. Xing made a show of turning to her and show. General Hua. Your army isn't pledged to me, is it? No, Prince Xing, Shou immediately answered. We've rebelled to support the princess, but that doesn't mean the First Continental Army is aligned with Ba Sing Se. Yet, the flames of hope were cruelly snuffed as the bound commanders realized what would follow. Well then, is there anything I can do to persuade you to join me, as your princess has done? Shou played along and glanced over his shoulder to his troops for a second, and then glanced back at Xing. Perhaps we might be convinced if we were allowed to dispense justice. Xing turned to Princess AZULA with a lazy smile. What say you, my princess? Her smile matched his. As Princess of Ba Sing Se, I hereby extradite you prisoners to the care of the rebels of the First Continental Army. Defeat tinged the captured commanders' pleas for mercy, but Dao led a few men to drag them back. Colonel Dao. Yeah. The oaf paused and turned to Xing with a puzzled frown just as the prisoners were exchanged. The prince wore a surprisingly somber expression. That serving girl that you sponsored? Shufang. She was with her family in Wuzhai when Bujing's army hit. We found her. He walked up and offered a small pouch to Dao, whose eyes were now wide with shock. His hands actually trembled as they gingerly received Xing's item, and heavy silence filled the air as the massive man, normally a loud and bloodthirsty brute, quietly opened the pouch to peer at the contents within. My condolences. The pouch dropped from Dao's meaty hand, spilling out a simple silver necklace and a small string bracelet, more like an oversized ring actually. Shufang. Dao looked up to stare emptily at Xing, who gave a slow, regretful shake of his head. One knew things were taking a dark turn when Shou subtly nudged her back a few steps. The other officers also shuffled back, making space between Dao and the prisoners, even as the troops escorting the prisoners hastily ran off and abandoned escorting the bound men. Even Xing's side were uncomfortably making some space, with only the scorpion remaining rooted on the spot. Sayufang. Dao's thunderous roar startled Hua and many others. Flames burst out from the colonel as he turned to the closest prisoner. The hapless commander didn't get a chance to scream as Dao's hands quickly wrapped around his neck and pulled. With a sickening crack and squelch, the man's head was ripped free from his neck, and Dao kept roaring even as the fountain of blood sprayed him right in the face. Shufang. He charged at another prisoner, and the new victim fell over as he tried to flee with his ankles still bound. Dao stomped on the man's back, visibly deforming the poor man's chest as spine and ribs broke. And the great thunder continued stomping, roaring in insensate rage as blood stained the prisoner's silk robes, and bones tore through the attire. Shou placed a comforting hand on Hua, drawing her attention from the grisly scene. Best to let him grieve. I'll have the army reorganize with Xing's people. Hua could only nod and watch as her husband gave the orders to the colonels, who were all doing their best to ignore the sorrowful roars and the sick cracking of bone and flesh. She too tried not to glance at Dao's way, nor the screaming prisoners who were trying to drag themselves out of his reach. A gesture from Shou had some men gingerly pushing back the prisoners towards the storm of rage. Whatever justice Princess AZULA or the troops might have had in mind, the prisoners' fates now likely far exceeded their imagination, leaving Dao to wreak bloody vengeance, while followed Shou to meet with Xing and Princess AZULA at a more comfortable and distant location. This time, the salute Shou offered was far less formal. Sad business that. Xing gave a single nod. Dao will be blaming himself for not taking her in, or sending her to Ba Sing Se. I'll have to see that he doesn't drown himself in drink, her husband sighed. Probably best to keep him from the front lines unless you don't want prisoners. This is not the first time. I take it? The princess asked with a half-worried look. Xing shook his head ruefully. Fourth, though it's the first to suffer from the Fire Nation. Dao might be too free in giving in to his passions, but he truly does care for those that catch his eye. Shou nodded gravely. It's quite a while ago since he lost a mistress. Koda had to throw his cavalry in to stop Dao from rampaging by himself the last time it happened. We didn't manage to keep many prisoners in that battle, and the stores of wine were emptied out in the course of 3 nights after that, Xing added. We had to burn his tent and some of his belongings because of how stained they ended up being. If he falls into such a state, why tell him now? Princess AZULA asked, looking truly appalled. Both Xing and Shou shrugged. He'll find out eventually, the prince answered. He writes to his mistresses frequently. All of them. And sometimes he forgets to remind them he's on campaign. And their replies return to his estate, to be read by his wife. Hence Lady Dao's constant state of wrath at her husband. Better to tell him now than to have him find out later, Shou added. Who knows where he'll be when that happens, and what kind of carnage he'll leave in his wake. Trying to stop him will only make you a target. Even Li Dai kept clear of Dao rather than trying to calm him down the second time it happened. It felt a little dirty weaponizing Dao's grief, but Hua had to agree with her husband. If this sort of rage was unleashed at the wrong time, in a town on the home islands, for example, the damage might be horrendous. If it cannot be helped, Princess AZULA began to say, waiting for earnest nods from Xing and Shou before continuing. Then we have no choice but to leave Colonel Dao to get it out of his system and move on to other matters. Agreed, Your Highness, Hua said, just a fraction of a second before her husband. The young royals and the married generals assembled their subordinates to plan the next stages of the counterattack, hashing out the objectives they needed to hit. With the bulk of the punitive force broken, they could afford splitting up to retake the coast and pushing back the foothold from the home island loyalists. The first priority, however, was to hit the nearest enemy port to capture some ships, which allowed Xing and the princess to launch a counter-invasion. It had to be done in a hurry, and Hua found herself shuddering with distaste along with many others as Xing briefed them on the day of Black Sunday. Further details were hashed out, as well as the reorganization from the reintegration of the 1st Continental Army into Omni-sensei. All officers from both parties kept fully focused on the planning, ignoring the muted roars in the background. Once the task was done, Hua took her husband aside for a brief private talk. I think it's best you tell me what other latent issues your friends might have, so I can prepare myself. Shou gave a chuckle. I think Dao about covers it. Unless you have a pretty brother, then best to keep him away from Koda. What? Shou placed a gentle hand on her shoulders as he led her back to their camp. Right, I forgot to tell you. You know how Koda is a bit overindulgent with his messenger boys. The 1st Continental Army is overjoyed to be of service to Her Highness, Princess AZULA. Hua and Shou knelt and saluted in unison on the grasslands just off the main trade road, and the rest of their army behind them echoed the gesture. Before them, Princess AZULA stood with a satisfied smile, while Prince Xing behind her wore a knowing smirk. It was like a ceremonial parade meeting between 2 army groups, like the changing of the guard or the induction of a new batch of recruits. Rise. It is I who should be grateful to have the loyalty of such loyal warriors. To the soft gasps of many soldiers, the princess bowed deeply before them. Even as a performance, it was a powerful gesture. Even Prince Iroh, back in his days as a gregarious and much beloved general, kept some royal distance from the common soldier. Here, the princess brought her head lower than her salute, diminishing her status before the army. Then again, Hua probably didn't have her family's lives drastically improved as some of the troops had experienced. She'd not witnessed her family fortunes reversed from impoverished obscurity, nor was she a colonist or refugee whose life was raised to rival the comforts of the home islands. The soldiers were concerned because they owed their lives to her, quite literally in many cases. To these people, loyalty to the princess was a given thing, taken as much as granted as breathing. For everyone else, Hua included, Princess AZULA's accomplishments and conduct was enough to keep them with the 1st Continental Army, or they were simply loyal to Xing like Shou. It amounted to the same thing. And on that note, Xing neatly cut in and stepped forwards. It's come to our attention that the invaders from home islands have been far from compassionate in their so-called mission to restore order in the colonies. Wa's eyes widened as the bedraggled and bound figure of High General Bujing was pushed up to the front, similarly bound men following after him. Princess AZULA immediately fell into a scowl as she turned to the prisoners, while Xing raised his voice to address the First Continental Army. High General Bujing has led his armies on a heartless march through many villages and towns. From the confessions we've taken so far, Wuzhai, Seiro, Nairang, and other such settlements along the West Lake were sacked. The civilians that fled too late were tortured for cruel amusement before being massacred. General Wa immediately felt the cold hostility from her soldiers behind her washing past her. How many of these people might have friends or family in those regions? Probably not a lot, as the regiments and grand battalions under the First Continental Army mostly drew any colonial manpower from the proper colonies up until the Civil War. Still, it was another slap to the face for any colonist from the callous fools of the home islands. Now, under the law set by Princess AZULA, while she served as colonial minister, such wanton carnage would be punished most heavily, whether the perpetrators be noble or commoner, colonist or from the home islands. But with her removal from said post by the Fire Lord, the colonial territories have reverted back to its old laws. The old laws meant nobles could, with varying degrees of spending, suffer at worst royal chastisement and some fines, just like what they'd face back in the home islands. Except that the lives of colonists and conquered Earth Kingdom natives were likely much cheaper to earn a slap on the wrist. Now, while Princess AZULA holds no official authority no, some soldiers immediately protested in outrage. Princess AZULA rules the colonies. The territories of the continent belong to Princess AZULA. Xing let the protest carry on for a few seconds before casually waving a hand to regain silence. He gave a lazy turn of his head towards the princess, who took a step forwards to stand beside him and address the agitated crowd. I am moved by your loyalty, but I cannot call myself ruler of the colonies. The colonies as we know it are mostly gone. Its people now under the protection of Boss Sing Se. Those that remain are shackled by the home island invaders. Even after all this is done, after I've brought my father and his lackeys to justice, there might be little reason to rebuild the ruins as the Earth Kingdom comes to retake what they see as theirs. The soldiers seemed ready to protest again, but Princess AZULA raised both hands placatingly. However, I am soon to be the princess of Ba Sing Se. My most loyal prince, Xing, has already promised to resettle the refugees and offer them a new home. Offer me a new home. It is an offer I have accepted, so that I can continue ensuring the well-being of those who place their trust in me. There is still much room in that great city. It is my hope that we can all create a new home in Ba Sing Se, together. Relocating to Ba Sing Se? That sounded, well, not exactly ambitious, but bold. Settling in the conquered capital city-state sent a strong message to both the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Wa found she rather liked the idea of moving there with Shou. Maybe they could get some dispensation from the young prince and princess to be removed from Ba Sing Se's political scene, so they could enjoy a peaceful retirement away from family and court life. Many officers and common soldiers alike seemed to share the sentiment, as they cheered their approval at the princess. Said princess silenced the crowd with a laconic wave of her hands. Prince Xing has most kindly granted me now the responsibilities and powers I will soon gain. I might not be colonial minister, nor wield the full authority of the Fire Nation, but I can charge these pillagers, these raiders, as princess of Ba Sing Se. What say you? The cheers were a roaring din this time, further solidifying Princess AZULA's legitimacy as princess of Ba Sing Se. It was a masterful stroke, as the princess' usual standard. Princess AZULA waited for the roars to quiet down before turning to the prisoners. Well then, with the powers vested to me as ruler of Ba Sing Se, for the crimes of encouraging raiding and preying on the innocent, I hereby sentence you lot you promised leniency. One of the prisoners interrupted, which was a cry quickly echoed by his fellows. We've done as you asked. Have you no honor? That is true, Xing spoke up, drawing their desperate attention to him. I did promise that Ba Sing Se will not harm you in exchange for your cooperation. Wa saw the flicker of hope flare to life in the prisoners, except for High General Bujing. At the same time, annoyance bubbled from the men behind her. Xing made a show of turning to her and Shou. General Wa, your army isn't pledged to me, is it? No, Prince Xing, Shou immediately answered. We've rebelled to support the princess, but that doesn't mean the First Continental Army is aligned with Ba Sing-se. Yet, the flames of hope were cruelly snuffed as the bound commanders realized what would follow. Well then, is there anything I can do to persuade you to join me, as your princess has done? Shou played along and glanced over his shoulder to his troops for a second, and then glanced back at Xing. Perhaps we might be convinced if we were allowed to dispense justice. Xing turned to Princess AZULA with a lazy smile. What say you, my princess? Her smile matched his. As Princess of Ba Sing-se, I hereby extradite you prisoners to the care of the rebels of the First Continental Army. Defeat tinged the captured commanders' pleas for mercy, but Dao led a few men to drag them back. Colonel Dao. Yeah. The oaf paused and turned to Xing with a puzzled frown just as the prisoners were exchanged. The prince wore a surprisingly somber expression. That serving girl that you sponsored? Shufang. She was with her family in Wuzhai when Bujing's army hit. We found her. He walked up and offered a small pouch to Dao, whose eyes were now wide with shock. His hands actually trembled as they gingerly received Xing's item, and heavy silence filled the air as the massive man, normally a loud and bloodthirsty brute, quietly opened the pouch to peer at the contents within. My condolences. The pouch dropped from Dao's meaty hand, spilling out a simple silver necklace and a small string bracelet, more like an oversized ring actually. Shufang. Dao looked up to stare emptily at Xing, who gave a slow, regretful shake of his head. One knew things were taking a dark turn when Shou subtly nudged her back a few steps. The other officers also shuffled back, making space between Dao and the prisoners, even as the troops escorting the prisoners hastily ran off and abandoned escorting the bound men. Even Xing's side were uncomfortably making some space, with only the scorpion remaining rooted on the spot. Sayufang. Dao's thunderous roar startled Hua and many others. Flames burst out from the colonel as he turned to the closest prisoner. The hapless commander didn't get a chance to scream as Dao's hands quickly wrapped around his neck and pulled. With a sickening crack and squelch, the man's head was ripped free from his neck, and Dao kept roaring even as the fountain of blood sprayed him right in the face. Shufang. He charged at another prisoner, and the new victim fell over as he tried to flee with his ankles still bound. Dao stomped on the man's back, visibly deforming the poor man's chest as spine and ribs broke. And the great thunder continued stomping, roaring in insensate rage as blood stained the prisoner's silk robes and bones tore through the attire. Shou placed a comforting hand on Hua, drawing her attention from the grisly scene. Best to let him grieve. I'll have the army reorganize with Xing's people. Hua could only nod and watch as her husband gave the orders to the colonels, who were all doing their best to ignore the sorrowful roars and the sick cracking of bone and flesh. She too tried not to glance at Dao's way, nor the screaming prisoners who were trying to drag themselves out of his reach. A gesture from Shou had some men gingerly pushing back the prisoners towards the storm of rage. Whatever justice Princess AZULA or the troops might have had in mind, the prisoners' fates now likely far exceeded their imagination. Leaving Dao to wreak bloody vengeance, Hua followed Shou to meet with Xing and Princess AZULA at a more comfortable and distant location. This time, the salute Shou offered was far less formal. Sad business, that. Xing gave a single nod. Dao will be blaming himself for not taking her in, or sending her to Ba Sing-se. I'll have to see that he doesn't drown himself in drink, her husband sighed. Probably best to keep him from the front lines unless you don't want prisoners. This is not the first time, I take it? The princess asked with a half-worried look. Xing shook his head ruefully. Fourth, though it's the first to suffer from the Fire Nation. Dao might be too free in giving in to his passions, but he truly does care for those that catch his eye. Shou nodded gravely. It's quite a while ago since he lost a mistress. Koda had to throw his cavalry in to stop Dao from rampaging by himself the last time it happened. We didn't manage to keep many prisoners in that battle, and the stores of wine were emptied out in the course of 3 nights after that, Xing added. We had to burn his tent and some of his belongings because of how stained they ended up being. If he falls into such a state, why tell him now? Princess AZULA asked, looking truly appalled. Both Xing and Shou shrugged. He'll find out eventually, the prince answered. He writes to his mistresses frequently. All of them. And sometimes he forgets to remind them he's on campaign, and their replies return to his estate, to be read by his wife. Hence Lady Dao's constant state of wrath at her husband. Better to tell him now than to have him find out later, Sho added. Who knows where he'll be when that happens, and what kind of carnage he'll leave in his wake. Trying to stop him will only make you a target. Even Li Dai kept clear of Dao rather than trying to calm him down the second time it happened. It felt a little dirty weaponizing Dao's grief, but Hua had to agree with her husband. If this sort of rage was unleashed at the wrong time, in a town on the home islands, for example, the damage might be horrendous. If it cannot be helped, Princess AZULA began to say, waiting for earnest nods from Xing and Shou before continuing. Then we have no choice but to leave Colonel Dao to get it out of his system, and move on to other matters. Agreed, Your Highness, Hua said, just a fraction of a second before her husband. The young royals and the married generals assembled their subordinates to plan the next stages of the counterattack, hashing out the objectives they needed to hit. With the bulk of the punitive force broken, they could afford splitting up to retake the coast and pushing back the foothold from the home island loyalists. The first priority, however, was to hit the nearest enemy port to capture some ships, which allowed Xing and the princess to launch a counter-invasion. It had to be done in a hurry, and Hua found herself shuddering with distaste along with many others as Xing briefed them on the day of Black Sunday. Further details were hashed out, as well as the reorganization from the reintegration of the 1st Continental Army into Ba-Sing-Se. All officers from both parties kept fully focused on the planning, ignoring the muted roars in the background. Once the task was done, Hua took her husband aside for a brief private talk. I think it's best you tell me what other latent issues your friends might have, so I can prepare myself. Shou gave a chuckle. I think Dao about covers it. Unless you have a pretty brother, then best to keep him away from Koda. What? Shou placed a gentle hand on her shoulders as he led her back to their camp. Right, I forgot to tell you. You know how Koda is a bit overindulgent with his messenger boys. Hyunji might find the water tribesmen to be rather primitive in appearance, but she had to admit their mastery over the waves was on another level above the Fire Nation's navy. Large boats, not even proper ships, made of wood, bone, and leather, took Princess AZULA's infiltrators into the Fire Islands with such speed and comfort that Hyunji almost forgot that she was at sea throughout most of the journey. They were dangerously good at being invisible too. On the final approach, the vessel's masts were taken down, and waterbenders would keep a wave up to completely hide the boats from across the horizon. Not that they risked much detection, coming in at night. Fire Nation warships with their reflective metal hulls were far more easily spotted under star and moonlight compared to the more matted colors of the Water Tribe fleet. During the day, the columns of black smoke gave away the positions of patrols. So it came as no surprise that Hyunji and her colleagues landed on the capital island unopposed and undetected. No doubt the other operatives being seated across targeted islands would have an easier time thanks to laxer security away from the capital. She even managed to keep her shoes completely dry, with how far into the coast the waterbenders guided their boats. The infiltrators snuck into the nearest town under the cover of night, their sharp attires easily buying them the cover of nobles passing through. Thanks to some eavesdropping, they easily bought the innkeeper's confidence by posing as scions eloping in an attempt to dodge the recent draft sweeping the Fire Nation. It was a stroke of luck, or proof that the spirits were indeed with Princess AZULA and Prince Xing, that the innkeeper was a quiet supporter of the princess, and was disapproving of the madness coming from the royal palace. The good man did not raise the price of the rooms as most establishments might, and even gave tips on the schedule of patrols. They stayed for the night, and then the agents split up to spread across the capital island to seek their targets. They had less than a week to prepare for the big day. Mere days to scout out their targets and figure out cunning plans to achieve their related objectives. Most soldiers would balk at having to undertake such dangerous missions with so little time for planning. A good thing then that Hyunji and her fellow infiltrators were not soldiers, but Princess AZULA's palace servants, having to act on information almost as soon as it left courtiers' mouths. Improvising was their specialty. A few days was a luxury compared to the tight schedules Hyunji had to work with sometimes, be it feeding messenger hawks laxatives to keep them from flying, and maybe intercept the deliveries, or arranging coincidental meetings with the right nobles leaving the palace to establish long-term sexpionage operations. The handmaidens and common staff have made do with their smaller presence in court politics by being quick and decisive. The only real obstacle for the princess agents lay not with the nature of their targets or objectives, but what happened after their mission was accomplished. Princess AZULA wanted everyone back alive and in one piece. "I have no use for corpses," she had sternly briefed them before they were sent out. "I'm sure I hired skilled staff with a good head on their shoulders, not narrow-minded martyrs. There is much work to be done after this excursion, so I expect all of you to be back and ready for more work." The princess was sweet in how she cared, but it still left the fact that they had to approach their tasks with a bit more restraint. Liangxi's idea of masquerading as a messenger to take out some of the courtiers during a royal court session had to be shelved, for example. So it'd be back to the basics, slinking through crowds and waiting for opportunities. If anything, the missions now have mostly become easier. There was no need to hide bodies or evidence of the hand behind the coming destruction. Princess AZULA wanted everyone to know that she still had a presence in the home islands, and so that was what her loyal servants would do. Hyunji and a few comrades spent the next couple of days infiltrating the capital city, and to her surprise a good chunk of the princess network remained intact, if somewhat in hibernation. The crippled veteran standing by the corner of a street was still there, railing with faux unhinged hysteria against the Earth Kingdom's evils as a cover for acting as a middleman. The bedraggled man was still tolerated, and was still running up to random passers-by to shake them by their collars, and dropping small slips of paper into some of his victims' robes. Tea houses that harvested information from its clientele remained in business, with no change in staff, though their decor changed to appease the Fire Lord's regime. Interestingly, in many establishments, the serving girls' uniforms became more conservative, with the slit on the side of their cheongsams being halved, while the serving boys sported longer sleeves. A good number of retired nobles no longer showed up in the pie show parlors, but to Hyunji's relief, those that remained assured her that the few that had been captured only endured mild interrogation before being put under house arrest. The Fire Lord was trying to rule with an iron fist, but as he relied on the nobility now more than ever to strengthen his rule, he couldn't be too callous in how he treated any of them, not without good, solid cause. The noble circles, for all their factionalism and cliques, was a class that was heavily interconnected, and Ozai's grip on power was not so absolute that he could dismiss their concerns. Even Princess AZULA's ardent supporters still had their family estates, it seemed, locked down but not forfeited. Their family members were detained, but as far as Hyunji knew, all had been kept under house arrest, with only the few commoners caught acting for the princess being sent to the Boiling Rock prison. Whether they'd serve as bargaining chips or not would remain to be seen. Knowing how political marriages worked, though, Hyunji bet that at least a few families were kept in good health simply because they were relatives to some degree to the Fire Lord's court. It made the handmaiden-turned-saboteur feel a little bad at all the violence she'll be involved in. Well, at least they would be limiting the collateral damage as much as possible. Well, physical damage anyway. Taking the appearance of a minor noble, Hyunji entered a funeral parlor. The owner seemed uncaring of her presence until she produced a small sack of coins. "I'd like to make several orders." "Why, of course, ma'am. My condolences on your losses. Are you seeking a ceremonial cremation?" Hyunji sniffed as she shook her head, putting a believable enough tremble in her movements, she thought. "No, just some urns, please. The ones that came back from the continent was inadequate." The man gave a convincing nod of sorrow, though his eyes remained on the sack of currency. "You have my deepest sympathies, ma'am. What would you require from my humble establishment?" Hyunji left with her servants, with several gaudy cremation urns, and it took the whole night to put the urns to good use. Lady Tai Li's training was most useful in getting them into places they shouldn't be, not to mention disabling guards before they touched exposed tits or tried to get their stinky lips anywhere on Hyunji. Before this, the agents would have to ready daggers or hairpins, which might be finicky to bring to bear, and often needed the victims to be varying degrees of handsy with them to guarantee an exposed target to strike at. Now all it took was for a quick jab of the fingers to the right spot, and the distracted men crumpled on the ground, still breathing too, which added another thin layer of chaos to the aftermath. It was heartening to see that news still traveled quickly even with more guards patrolling the city. Several notable families were in a panic when their patriarchs and matriarchs awoke to find the urns with their name on it. Considering that there were also whispers of a few dying horribly after that, some of the recipients were stupid enough to actually open the urns and trigger the flint and blasting jelly mechanism within. It was freaking unbelievable. She was sure the simple trap would have been completely avoided. Thanks to overestimating the noble's paranoia and common sense, she lost a whole month's wage to 3 fellow agents. Over the coming days and nights, other clandestine operations were carried out, some to scare certain nobles and wealthy merchants, others to scare their families and friends via blatant assassination. Who died and who got to wake up shitting themselves was dependent on how high they or their courtier relatives were on Princess AZULA's shit list. Unfortunately for the nobles of the Fire Nation, Lady Sue's ability to hold on to grudges gave her a very good memory. By the time the big day came, and Hyunji saw something flying towards the royal palace, most of the nobility residing in and around the capital city were nowhere to be seen in public, preferring to lock themselves in and hiring more guards to keep the night terrors at bay. Rather conveniently, it meant that a few operatives got rather comfortable positions patrolling their targets' estates. The postings wouldn't amount to much beyond intelligence gathering, but that wasn't the point right now. What was important was that Ozai's supporters were put on edge, which means some of them, at least half, Hyunji hoped for her next salary's sake, would be compromising their duties to the Fire Lord in favor of ensuring their own continued safety. Lookouts reported notable absences in courtiers heading to the palace, and if the whispers bot could be believed, the Fire Lord was most displeased, though he didn't have the manpower to do anything beyond bolstering the palace's security. Fun times. As Hyunji and her fellow infiltrators joined the crowd in looking up at the afternoon sky to follow the air bison flying above their heads, she fought hard to keep down a grin. They slipped through the confused city folk and headed for their final targets. Once the princess and her prince appeared, some nobles needed their loyalties tested, or their last words remembered. Zuko was almost comfortable with his routine as a prisoner as the days turned into weeks. Through piecing together the rare whispers he and Mai picked up during the day, they managed to build a good enough picture of what was going on beyond the palace walls. And the picture did not look good for Zuko's father. Assuming it was not propaganda, most of the colonies were razed and abandoned by the rebels to deny the Fire Nation army a solid foothold on the continent. Would AZULA resort to such a plan? Thanks to their lessons, and no doubt her closeness to Xing, most definitely yes. It shouldn't be surprising that practically all the colonies sided with her, though for them to willingly abandon their homes for Ba Sing Se spoke of a devotion that the prince quietly envied. At the same time, the Earth Kingdom protectorates took the chance to free themselves from the Fire Nation, so that made the borders on the continent interesting. The only saving grace for Father's armies was that the self-liberated states opted to lock themselves within their gates to stay out of the civil war. Otherwise, all it'd take was for a few raiding parties to prey on supply routes to slowly starve out certain forces. Also unsurprisingly, Omashu was leading the push north, breaking through the thinned or outright abandoned southern lines to reclaim the Earth Kingdom. What was surprising, however, was the possibility that Xing and King Bumi had hammered out some sort of deal. The whispers were inconsistent about this. Either the Scorpion Dragon and the Mad King were allies, or they agreed to stay out of each other's way. Yet at the same time, some rumors are saying that Bumi was in Ba Sing Se, helping Xing fortify the walls. Do you think he'd do that? Mai asked, causing Zuko to pause and really consider it. Would Xing so easily work with enemies? That really depended. As far as Zuko knew, Xing's duel and victory over Bumi was conducted without any acrimony on either end. Probably. More likely they just improvised off an existing scheme. His time with AZULA and Xing via guarding Mai gave Zuko some insight into how the couple operated. And the Fire Nation prince had a growing suspicion that they had, or at the very least Xing had plans involving Omashu. Maybe it was initially meant to broker peace between Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Maybe it was a plan to win over the Mad King. Regardless, Omashu and Ba Sing Se were friendly now, which got a lot of the palace staff worried underneath their masks of servitude. That worry became more obvious when they began whispering to each other about the defeats trickling in. Armies were being held up or harassed by colonists. General Shou and General Hua had joined AZULA's cause. That one was quite obvious, Zuko thought, and the War Council was scrambling to figure out how to deal with that impressive army. Then came news of High General Wulong's demise and the shattering of his force, and dragons were involved. Real dragons, the increasingly panicked servants shared amongst each other. At least 2 dragons that burned and devoured men. Wulong had died facing Xing, and it was either out of contempt or respect that the Prince of Ba Sing Se let the surviving officers and their troops flee. Xing had dragons. How long did he have them? Did AZULA know all along as well? I'm surprised no one's thinking he faked a dragon, Mai remarked with a worried frown. He's been known to pull off a lot of tricks. As much as Zuko would like to agree with her, shook his head. Too many eyewitnesses. Bujing's report alone carries the testimonies of several nobles. If Xing made fake dragons, he did a really good job at fooling everyone. He paused for a second to sigh. And I think there's no reason for him to do that. Xing doesn't need dragons to win. AZULA doesn't need dragons to come over here. So it's just a nice bonus for them. Zuko nodded with another sigh as he recalled his lessons, both from Xing and the palace tutors. It's one way to really scare a lot of people. It took a lot of people to hunt dragons during my great-grandfather's time. Like small armies big. It's seen as a prestigious thing because of how dangerous it was. And now, Xing has 2 of them to go along with Xing himself. Zuko finished, not needing to explain that by now the other prince was probably far more dangerous than the dragons he had with him. He'd not seen the holes in Ba Sing Se, but he could very well believe that no dragon could do what Xing did there. Mai gave a weary sigh. And who knows what AZULA turned into in the meantime, which was also concerningly true. Fighting with Xing, she'd likely grow into a monster of her own on the battlefield. Supposedly, she slew several generals by herself in the same battle that Wulong fell. A knock on Mai's door made them both freeze for a second before annoyance surfaced on their faces. Again, wasn't the first stupid test enough of a failure? Still, better not take things for granted. Zuko slipped out of Mai's bed and quietly stalked over to the door. This time, there was no quivering servant to greet him when he opened it. Instead, a small piece of embroidered red silk was left by the doorway. Zuko carefully picked it up, ignoring the nearly overlooked sound of soft footsteps, and bringing it to the lamps near Mai's bed. He found his eyes going wide along with Mai's at the details of the embroidery. A black scorpion stood to the foreground, with a yellow rising phoenix in the background. Both Zuko and Mai had only ever heard AZULA talking about it, her hypothetical emblem once she was married to Xing. It was a conversation only brought up when Ty Lee prodded her. There was no way that anyone could get those details beyond the idle talks in the privacy of her tent. Mai took the cloth and flipped it over, a simple message sewn onto the back. Wait for my people. We'll have your family ready. And maybe Dum-Dum if you still like him. If you do, hope you're not pregnant yet. It was definitely AZULA's message. Zuko snapped his head to Mai with a sudden urgency. I'll be back. He snuck off back to his room and found a similar cloth, but this time on his bed. The message behind the emblem was a little longer. Zuzu, Uncle Iroh hopes you're well. If you're with us, throw this out the window. My people will come get you out later. You're worse than father at lying, so don't try. You better not have gotten Mai pregnant. Dum-Dum. He didn't know exactly how to react to his sister's words. On the one hand, AZULA didn't sound too worried, and Uncle Iroh was still all right. At least that's what AZULA says anyway. And she has a plan to bring Mai and her family out of the palace, along with Zuko. But at the same time, did AZULA really have that low a regard for him that she expected him to make Mai pregnant? Zuko sighed as he threw the cloth out the window, and was completely unsurprised to find it missing the following morning. News filtered in of chaos now spreading through the home islands, including the capital city, where nobles were waking up with messages by the princess beside them, or not waking up at all. Facilities in the factory islands were razed, as were the holiday estates of wealthier nobles. In response, Zuko noted how the guards in his palace wing and Mai's were reduced, probably to bolster security elsewhere. The servants going about were also reduced due to fear of spies. Zuko might not have seen his father at all, but he could very well imagine the Fire Lord's impotent fury. Far too many men have been sent over to the continent to deal with Xing and AZULA. The minimum garrison to maintain peace in each settlement buckled under the string of sabotages and assassinations. Another round of conscription might be sent out, though it'd be too little too late. Barely a couple of days later, the servants were running about with fear distracting them in their duties. High General Bujing was dead, as were most of the commanders with him. And with them, the bulk of the Fire Nation's manpower was killed or scattered throughout the continent. Worse, Xing and AZULA had taken one of the staging ports, and thanks to the sudden defection of Admiral Dayong and more than half his fleet, They were making their way over to the home islands. Azula's servants came knocking at Zuko's door on that very evening. The bad news sent everyone into a panic. One of her handmaidens he vaguely remembered greeted him with a fluid bow that made her look out of place in the servant's outfit. "Prince Zuko, come with me, please. We will rendezvous with Lady Mai and her family, and then make our exit." Taking only his swords with him, it took almost no effort in sneaking past the gossiping guards and servants, and Zuko found Mai, her worried mother Michi, and brother Tom Tom waiting in a garden with a small group of more of Azula's staff that the prince could just barely remember seeing once. "Where's your father?" Zuko had to ask, and Mai flashed a scowl. "Out cold." It startled the prince that Michi also gave a similar expression. "My husband tried to insist on us staying. His desire to cling on to his precious position in court has blinded him to the dangers it has put our family in. I will not let my children be used as bargaining chips." "Well put, Lady Michi," one of the spies remarked. "We'll do what we can to keep Lord Akano alive, but in the meantime, please follow us." The agents stomped their feet on the garden soil, and to Mai's family's surprise, and maybe a bit from Zuko, the ground opened up, revealing an underground stairway made of earth. Right, Shing had earthbenders with him, and Azula didn't care about discriminating against earthbenders in the colonies, so having them working for the couple should have been expected. A man's head popped up from the impromptu tunnel and beckoned them over. "Right this way, Your Highness, ladies." They left the palace and with fire bending to serve as torches, followed the tunnel out into a tea house's basement. "There's beds upstairs on the higher floors," one handmaiden instructed. "This shop's shuttered, so just stay away from the main hall, and the rest of the place should be safe to move around in. You just have to be a little patient and wait for a day or two." "What happens after that?" Zuko asked. The handmaiden and her colleagues grinned. "All right, it's best to brief you about the day of Black Sunday." Now that's an ominous name. Island hopping across the Fire Islands was, for all the tasks Shing assigned Aang and his friends, largely uneventful. There were far too little soldiers and town guards to offer any real problems. With the earlier briefings from Iroh and Shing to guide him, Aang took to sabotaging in a thorough manner that his earlier adventures could never match. In the dead of night, they flew through a poorly guarded factory complex covering an entire island, stopping only for Toph to seal up the metal wastewater pipes or Katara to reverse the water flow to flood and irrevocably damage the machinery and forges. Sokka had meticulously planned the routes they took, ensuring that maximum damage was caused on the factory island before the sun rose. The young Avatar chipped in as well, melting or cutting through structural beams, or helping Toph carve channels to send the hills of coal and or rolling down into the coast or river. Dockyards and roads were also broken up with ample use of earthbending. Just for added insult, Aang and Katara collected as much of the polluted water as they could, and then sent it upstream to flood the barracks and overseers' homes, as well as taint their wells. It should serve as a good lesson. Otherwise, at the very least, it'd still slow down the Fire Nation's war effort that much more. They hit other islands in a similar manner, destroying only the war factories and shipyards, with barely any real damage inflicted on the island's populace or garrisons. It was somewhat comforting to know that even Shing and Azula were averse to targeting innocent civilians in their campaign of terror. By the time they reached the outskirts of the capital island, Aang counted about 4 islands visited in just as many days. The gang hunkered down in an abandoned noble's estate on the outskirts of Capital City. Supposedly, its previous residents had been evicted by Azula due to corruption. Aang tried not to think about it too much. Questionable as her actions were, Azula was true to her word, just like Shing. The sprawling manor was some ways off the main road, which meant the risk of nosy patrols checking on them were minimized. It was also still stocked with supplies, as the old owners had been ejected in a hurry. Most of the food in the pantry and storeroom had rotted and had to be thrown out, but the sacks of flour and dried meat were still edible enough, and the overgrown garden still had fruits and vegetables to sate Aang's diet, coupled with the residence being fully furnished, if a bit dusty. It was probably one of the gang's more comfortable stays outside of Omashu and Agna Kele. The plan was to wait for the right day before moving out again, and seeing that their trip was far smoother than expected, the gang had some days left to while away. Fortunately, the manor provided ample distraction during their wait. Sokka spent a whole afternoon after their first night in the main study room and going through its displays of weapons and armor. Toph found a disturbing amount of amusement in listening to Katara read aloud various Fire Nation romance books, while the waterbender spent the time outside of giggling along with Toph, rifling through the noble's vanity tables. Not that Aang paid too much attention to Katara experimenting with makeup. No, sir, he was most definitely not stealing glances, as the girl fixated on the mirror as she combed her hair or smacked her lips after applying lipstick. It didn't help at all when occasionally Katara would ask him for his thoughts. What do you think, Aang? Does this Fire Nation face powder make me look a bit like a mime? No, she did not. Katara applied just a fine dusting of white face powder to lighten the tint of her skin only by a smidge. The rouge on her cheeks and the highlights on her eyes made her look nice. It was an interesting kind of nice, but still nice nonetheless. But for some reason he couldn't tell her that, only managing to shake his head vigorously. And that made Katara freeze up and quickly turn away, and Aang might have been imagining the rouge on her cheeks darken. The airbender tried not to stick around Katara's alone time after that, and focused instead on his training. He recalled Iroha's and Bumi's lessons to refine his stance and movements, as well as the tips given by Katara's and Sokka's grandaunt in regards to waterbending. It was disturbing to know that their bending arts were used towards brutal ends, but Aang could not deny that combat bending had made his movements sharper and more fluid. The difference between how Bumi and Yama earthbended, with quick bursts of chi that gave little time for anyone to react, compared to Toph's raw but telegraphed moves, was obvious once it was pointed out to Aang and Toph, to her annoyance at first, as was Kylan's more ruthless and rapid use of water and ice compared to Pakku and Katara. Even Iroh had demonstrated the difference in traditional firebending and the pared-down version used by skilled warriors. In all cases, the emphasis was on channeling chi as efficiently as possible, which resulted in less bodily movements and faster bending. The amount of force used was secondary to the speed and accuracy in which it was applied, where Katara focused on drawing water towards herself for a couple of seconds before sending out a powerful whip. Kylan would fling the water from its source to her targets in smaller, but no less dangerous blades of water. She compensated for the lack of a shield in the blob of water Katara used by darting around a lot, and even with her advanced age, Kylan managed to close the distance with Aang or Katara during sparring more often than not. In combat, being twice as fast as your opponent not only means you'll hit him first, but you also get to hit him twice as many times. Kylan's cheery smile during her lecture was eerie. Not as sinister as Hama's according to Katara, but it carried a sort of edge to it. The kind that warned Aang to be mindful about how close he sat next to Katara. A small but quickly formed water blade will cut just as well as a large one, and doesn't take up much of your attention to wield. A small ice shield might shatter after catching one firebolt, but it's easy enough to create that you'll have 5 more thrown out as you make your escape, which is infinitely better than being stuck in place keeping a single bulky ice wall up. Slow and unwieldy bending leaves you open if the attack is avoided or the defense is breached. She finished with a casual shrug. Of course, if you're as powerful as you are fast, all the better. 3 avalanches beat 1 any day. Just mind your stamina. And while Bumi personally preferred raw displays of power, he also had Aang focus on smaller, more accurate earthbending rather than the massive boulders and columns that he and Toph liked to use. If you can thread a needle through a string, a boulder through a house becomes far easier. Isn't it threading a string through a needle? Puffed. Where's the difficulty in that? Anyway, once you get used to concentrating your bending into a fine point, it'll make fights in difficult places a lot easier. Also helps if you're worried about hitting the wrong people. Do it quickly, and you'll get tired of winning so many fights. The advice from the elders made Aang, Toph, and Katara shift their usual training to focus on speed and precision. Unsurprisingly, Toph was the first to reach a minimum for her movements, while conjuring detailed sculptures from the ground instead of the usual columns and boulders. It was a little more challenging for Aang and Katara, but there was definite progress there. Even Sokka spent some time swinging his sword against armor racks taken from the study room, honing his skills to the point where he was practicing in eerie silence, and only the slicing of the air could be heard. The big day came a couple of days later, and the gang flew out at dawn. The accessories to Appa's armor was fully deployed, covering the air bison in thick leather and plates of metal. Despite the weight that would slow him down, Aang's careful use of fire bursts helped get the air bison up in the air in no time, and get them soaring towards their target at a rate much faster than Appa's usual speed. They did not hit the capital immediately, but instead headed for the main docks, which led to the Royal Plaza. Appa swooped low, and the Avatar announced his presence by delivering a careful barrage of fire into the weapon ports of the guard towers looming over the plaza. Oversized bolt throwers were turned into twisted heaps of metal when the flames inevitably washed into the towers and heated up exposed bolt heads tipped with blasting jelly. Aang felt some guilty relief at seeing the tower's sentries limping out from the billowing smoke, singed but otherwise unharmed. Those towers that did not explode fell victim instead to Katara's barrage of ice shards cutting through cords and chains of the bolt throwers to disable them. Or whole towers were toppled instead when Toph got bored and leapt off Appa, encased in metal. The response from the defenders were annoyingly quick, and after the first attack run, Toph had to quickly climb back on for Appa to take to the safety of the skies. Bolts of metal and fire tried to bracket them in, but Aang and Katara kept the projectiles at bay with water and wind. Sokka kept track of the retaliation, finding a pattern for them to exploit. Right, it takes them at least 15 seconds to reload those bolt throwers. It should be enough time for us to hit a tower and head back up. Aang felt like they could hit 2 towers with that time, but agreed with Sokka to err on the side of caution. And wait for it. And now, that tower right below us. They dove in, and Aang was quietly glad that the crew of the bolt thrower knew what was coming and fled instead of trying for a desperate reload. The airbenders sent out a blast of air first, to knock them out of the tower, before pouring flames to set off the ammunition stored within. Appa took to the skies again with long seconds to spare, and they were well out of harm's way when the next salvo of giant explosive arrows filled the air. With Sokka's timing, Aang repeated the stunt 4 more times in succession, each time feeling relief warring with his guilt as he hesitated just a fraction in his attacks to let the tower's inhabitants clear out. Their objective here was to disable the towers and not slaughter everyone they could, Aang convinced himself. He would not partake in bloody violence like Xing for as long as he could. There was enough guilt on his hands as is. Appa was about to dive in for a 6th attack run when the gang noticed something from the horizon out at sea. A single line of white light pierced the sky. Xing's signal. Right, the crazy psychopath is here, Sokka noted redundantly. So, do we stick around for another go? Aang shook his head. No, we stick to the plan. It'll take time to find Ozai, even if he's in the royal palace. Good point, though we can't find him too fast, Toph added with a nod. Aang set off 2 brilliant blasts of fire into the air to answer Xing's signal before Appa took the gang into the heart of the Fire Nation. The palace complex was directly before them, so they were circling above it in no time, trying to figure out the best place to land. If they got off at the wrong place, and the Fire Lord was not there, it might take them too long to reach the other end of the palace. What are the chances he's hiding in one of the spires? Katara posed. Toph scowled. I won't be surprised, but I'd rather he hide in some underground room. We need to get this over with, Aang said to refocus his friend's attention. Appa will go in low, and it should get us a good look for clues on where we need to go. It was an unneeded tactic, because as Appa began his descent, the roof of one of the palace wings trembled and gave a metallic groan that caused everyone to wince. The whole top seemed to stretch upwards, and then burst like overstretched leather as something rose up from underneath it. Timber, bricks, and shingles fell away, revealing a somewhat familiar shape. Aang and his friends gaped in shock as a larger version of the Mechanist's balloon rose lazily into the air, its entire hull glinting with a metallic sheen under the afternoon sun. It was shaped like a warship, possessing an upwards-pointed prow, though the bridge and deck hung underneath instead. And on those decks, Aang could make out Appa move. Just in time, the air bison dodged the sudden barrage of human-sized bolts that shot out from the warship. With a blast of fire, Aang helped Appa climb higher, buying them some distance from the new threat. A metal airship. The Fire Nation had metal airships now. Not only that, the Fire Lord's gonna be in that thing, isn't he? Sokka sighed. If he's not, I'm going to really kick his, but once we find him, Katara surprisingly added. Thanks to Admiral Daeyong revealing his loyalties at the most opportune time. A sizable armada gathered by the coast of Zilong's ruins, and instead of bombarding the Ba Sing Se army on sight, lowered their boarding ramps to welcome their princess. The Northern Fleet does not forget the deeds of the royal princess and the young dragon. We stand with you, Princess AZULA, so that Fire Lord Ozai and his court of fools do not unleash another Zhao on the world. It was an acceptable enough reasoning from a rational man. So AZULA didn't nitpick too much about ensuring loyalties and such. Besides, the Fire Nation would need competent leaders after this. The princess had a bone to pick with her father and his lackeys, not the entirety of the kingdom itself. The loss of life so far was regrettable, but largely unavoidable. The flames of change would need to burn deep to truly purge the idiocy and corruption in the Fire Nation. And unfortunately, the cost of such thoroughness was significant collateral. Hopefully, the scattered soldiers on the continent would heed the offer for amnesty to further alleviate unnecessary deaths. It was a shame the offer also applied to the nobles, but as Xing and Uncle Iroh advised, there needed to be a minimum of the upper classes to keep the Fire Nation's social structure from collapsing immediately. Change was good, but it had to be regulated, otherwise anarchy would undo all AZULA wished to achieve. Maybe she shouldn't have let Xing unleash Dao on Bujing and his lot. The High General's head might be more useful as an obedient sycophant rather than a pulped message to scare the prisoners into behaving. But at the same time, there were still a lot more captured nobles from both Wulong's and Bujing's armies that had supplicated themselves before AZULA out of fear. More than enough to make up for the loss of 2 mediocre High Generals. Despite her own wants, AZULA traveled on a separate ship from Xing, who had with him the majority of the 11th in the fastest warship of the fleet. They would be the dagger to pierce through probably the first and greatest obstacle in the invasion's path. The flaming net barrier that was the Great Gates of AZULA, standing in the bridge of Admiral Daang's flagship. Even in the dark of night, AZULA could still make out the specks on the opposite ends in the horizon that were the islands housing massive dragon statues, as well as another one in the middle, which was sure to be the statue of her grandfather AZULA. Hidden out of view was a massive length of net lying slack underwater between AZULA and each dragon. On sighting any trouble, the robust pulley systems would pull up the nets, creating a barrier for any naval force. To further foul up any attempts at breaching through the defense, the cart-thick ropes were coated in an alchemical oil that allowed them to be set alight even when freshly pulled up from the seas. It was one of the great feats of engineering back in the day, and somewhere between that and the fleet was Xing's ship, headed straight to turn the defense into mere artwork. The horizon lit up as the net was raised and set alight. It took little time for a wall of orange-tinted smoke to rise up. And then, just as the curtain of fire and smoke was neatly parted in one section, as Xing snuffed out the flames on one section of the net wall. By the time the fleet drew close enough to make out the silhouette of Grandfather AZULA, the barricade to the statue's left had been severed and sank back into the waves. AZULA couldn't help the grin on her face. "We have a clear path, Admiral. Full speed to the capital." There were flashes of combat as the guards in the statue and islands tried putting up a fight. But Xing's ship eventually continued on its way. The rest of the fleet was not too far behind, which was convenient because by dawn they ran into the last line of the capital city's naval defense. A flotilla drawn from damaged or reassigned ships formed a defiant battle line against the invasion fleet. They had almost 30 vessels that AZULA could see. Admiral Daang had 93 warships under his command. The defenders managed 2 salvos from their trebuchets before they were rammed and boarded. AZULA was pleased to know that most of the enemy crew had been captured. She'll have time to find out later if these stubborn sailors were loyal to her father or the Fire Nation. Hopefully it was the latter. Such fearlessness should not go unrewarded. Xing set off the signal once the royal docks were in sight, and to AZULA's relief, the counter-signal burst into the air seconds later. The way was clear. The young avatar was not as hopeless as she had expected. "Admiral, have the troops prepare for landfall." "By your will, Your Highness." The Admiral gave the princess a speculative look. "I take it you'll be joining the assault?" "Naturally. The faster me and Xing break through to my father, the faster we can put an end to the fighting and the wasteful bloodshed." Daang gave a grave nod as he saluted formally. "Then allow me and my marines to escort you, Your Highness." That was somewhat surprising. AZULA raised a curious eyebrow. "You'll be joining us? I thought your place would be here on the bridge." The Admiral let out a soft chuckle. "It might be selfish of me, but I'd rather not watch such a momentous occasion unfold from so far away. Besides, it'll only require a minimum crew to keep the ship's artillery operational." AZULA nodded with approval. "So long it does not mess up the chain of command once the fighting starts." "I'll see you in a moment, Admiral." "Suki, come." We've preparations to make. Thanks to the Avatar's prep work, the landing went largely unopposed, with Xing and the 11th keeping the beachhead secure against the city's garrison. From what AZULA could see before she went below decks, the fighting was muted, as the domestic forces were reluctant in engaging the 11th, and the regiment was content to just keep their enemies at bay to avoid overstretching their line. Barely any artillery towers guarding the huge approach to the city were still intact to do any significant suppression as the landings began. They were all erased as a threat anyway when the ships retaliated with their own bombardment. Soon tanks, cavalry and men poured out to engage their opposite number, and it became obvious as the hardened veterans of the continent clashed with the dutiful but inexperienced garrison that the tide of war was skewed heavily on the invaders' side. So much so that AZULA caught many of the troops on her side taking the luxury of maneuvering to incapacitate rather than kill their foes. In Princess AZULA's name, stand down and surrender, Mosey and the other commanders bellowed over the din of combat. Stand down or there won't be enough of you left to send back to your families. Dao roared more crassly. AZULA waded through combat, barely needing to lift a finger as Admiral Dayang's men formed a strong enough protective bubble to ward her and Suki from any real fighting. She could make out Xing's white flames in the distance, as more easily the dragons swooping into the masses like clouded kingfishers. That she was barely slowing in her advance told the princess of just how well they were winning, and hearing the soldiers yell her name in their battle cries filled her with immense gratification. Drawing closer to the city walls, AZULA's army finally encountered resistance worthy of being a threat. The War Ministry's full might was arrayed by the main gates. Squadrons of tanks of different variants rumbled in anticipation behind rows of heavy infantry with their bulbous armor. AZULA clicked her tongue in annoyance at seeing so many unidentified prototype weapons that her agents had missed back while she was still colonial minister. Clearly she had to up her intrigue game after this if the War Ministry could keep so many of their inventions out of her reach. The Princess Army took a moment to reorganize their ranks, just in time to concentrate their fire to counter the barrage from the tanks and the wall's defenses. Thanks to the Scorpion's reputation, the commanders had their firebenders focus on the clay jars first, ensuring that their contents of blasting jelly or oil or whatever else would not spill into the ranks. Some sort of explosive round sent a storm of shrapnel that tore a hole through a mass of infantry. A few trebuchet payloads turned out to be blasting jelly-tipped javelins bundled together. Oversized bolas were frantically shot down before the chain links bisected more men. Officers bellowed orders to pull back the more vulnerable cavalry and form firebender squads to intercept incoming fire. Tanks took to the front to form an iron shield against the worst of the incoming barrage. Far behind the walls, where the royal palace was, something stirred, like a great beast rising from its underground den. AZULA spat a curse as she saw a massive metallic thing the size of a palace swing rising up into the air, as well as the speck that was probably Avatar Aang and his friends flying around it like a fly. That would be a problem for later. Right now, they needed to get into the city. It took a while, but eventually the invading force was moving again, more slowly this time. AZULA would have felt her irritation grow, if not for the sight of Xing and Dao with their troops hastily working to unfold and assemble the war gliders. It was time for the Scorpion to bring out his toys to test against the enemies. The gliders shot off in blasts of fire, and AZULA fought back the urge to punch her fist in satisfaction as she saw confusion infect the War Ministry's ranks. The light war machines flew well over everyone's heads, dropping clay jars of naphtha to smother tanks and artillery pieces in foul smoke. The chaos that was sown eased the barrage on the invasion force, and General Wa's voice cut through the roars and cries to order a full advance. With their bombing run completed, most of the gliders climbed up to the sky, and then dove straight down into the formation of confused defenders like a starling swarm. Haha, dive! Even from that far away, Bloody Dao was still hurting AZULA's ears with his screaming. The gliders crashed straight into the enemy, with a few ramming into the trebuchets at the walls. The effects of the vertical charge was immediately felt on AZULA's end. As the bombardment her army endured all, but dissipated completely. This time it was General Shou's voice ringing out. Continental Army, advance! For the Phoenix Princess. For Princess AZULA. They charged with a deafening roar, and AZULA found herself dashing ahead with Suki to avoid the press of armored bodies. It felt like an instant that they closed the distance and rushed it into melee. But she wasn't complaining. With Suki guarding her back and keeping her from straying too far, AZULA waded through fight after fight. She knocked the carapaced heavy infantry on their backs with blasts of fire, and left their dismantling to the infantry. She climbed onto tanks to bathe their interior with fire. Suki, in the meantime, darted about to keep her back clear, slicing and stabbing with precision against severely outmatched firebenders. AZULA. She paused after sending a squad of heavy infantry twitching uncontrollably to the ground with her lightning, craning her neck up to find Xing diving towards her. AZULA turned to punch an opportunistic soldier in the guts, and sent the would-be ambusher flying with a blast of fire, just in time for her Xing to land with the rest of his people. "Xing, so good of you to join us." Her prince simply nodded, and then glanced to the airship floating away. "We've not much time. Big flying thing. Want to help me help the Avatar get in?" AZULA broke into a grin. "I thought you'd never ask." Rufin, a glider for AZULA and Suki. Orochi. Kain. The dragons arrived shortly with them with yip roars, their claws and snouts bloodied, but otherwise appearing in good health. Kain still had one clawed hand piercing a scrap of segmented metal, probably a part of a pauldron. "You two keep AZULA safe, all right?" AZULA didn't protest the protective gesture. Besides, arriving with 2 dragons by her side was sure to be quite a scene, wouldn't it? And focused instead on climbing into the glider with Suki. With loyal soldiers keeping their surroundings clear, the war gliders took off once more. And this time it took occasional blasts of fire to keep it climbing up towards the lone metal airship. The nimble flyers easily dodged the explosive-tipped bolts hurled their way, and found the Aang's air bison taking similar evasive maneuvers as it tried to find a suitable landing spot. The open decks were lousy with firebenders and archers, as well as bolt throwers. An impressive enough design, AZULA had to admit. The princess couldn't help but imagine just how many of such flying machines the Fire Nation could have made if they hadn't wasted all that metal on the stupid drill. Or rebuild the fleet after Zhao's stupid quest. They caught up with the Avatar and his flying bison. As they flew side by side, they were practically yelling at each other to form any reasonable communication. "We need a place to land," the airbender monk complained. "What about the top?" AZULA offered, but the plucky gang shook their heads. "They've got soldiers up there too." "Then we'll just ground the damned thing," Kai yelled through the rushing air, which elicited looks of horror from the Avatar and his friends. "It'll crash into the city," the water tribe girl, Katara, protested. Xing nodded. "We'll need to land and take over it then, to get this flying thing out to a safer spot. You got a plan?" AZULA asked, and her fiancé grinned. "I clear us a spot." Some impromptu aerial planning was conducted, and then Xing's war glider darted towards the airship again, with trusty Koshi with him as ever. The rest of them kept a holding pattern as they watched the lone glider avoid the storm of incoming fire. AZULA's breath hitched as she saw Xing leap out of the glider, and only when the deck he landed on glowed red hot, and the crew either fell overboard or disappeared up into the ship, that she let out a relieved exhale. "Right, Xing's cleared us a spot. Let's go." They made a beeline for the landing zone, with the Avatar leading the way and warding off most of the attacks with wind, fire, and water. A few gliders were nicked or singed, but all managed to drop off their passengers onto the cooled deck with no losses. Xing greeted them with a smile and a wave of his hand, a whimpering soldier curled up by his feet. "It's a couple dozen of us, against maybe 60 or so of the Fire Lord's personal guard. Not to mention the rest of the crew." He looked out to the sky in thoughtful silence for a second, before continuing. "We might have less than half an hour left to get past all of that to the Fire Lord. Any complaints?" The soldiers of the 11th that came along simply offered smirks and grins, while Aang's gang, that was an annoyingly catchy way to describe them, were more determined and grim in their expressions. "Right then, Avatar Aang, we'll clear the way for you." Xing lightly kicked at the curled-up soldier by his feet. "The Fire Lord's likely in the command bridge, or his quarters. Thankfully, both are relatively close to one another. Save your strength, and leave the fighting to us." AZULA shared a nod with Xing, finding comfort in the resolve in his eyes. "Come, it's time the flames of change swept my father away." Sokka was not afraid to admit he was way out of his depth this time. Following Xing and his band into the metal airship, the gang were kept well back from the fighting and only faced the aftermath of it as they passed by smoldering or mauled corpses. Only Toph with her tremor sense had the clearest picture of the brutality that went on ahead in the narrow corridors. And the girl's face was tight and pale as she clearly fought to keep her resolve. Occasionally, a threat would come close enough for Suki to intercept before it got to AZULA, who was right in front of the group. Sokka still couldn't help being shocked at how lethal the Kyoshi warrior was in her movements compared to when they first met. It was a good thing that his stupid first impression of them hadn't really pissed her or her fellow warriors off. They'd pause every now and then for Shing to check on everyone. Katara was asked to help heal bleeding wounds or charred flesh. She did so without complaint, though her face too was fixed with tense grimness. Disconcertingly, Shing and his soldiers were far more lighthearted about being bloodied. Kai traded friendly insults with a man who had suffered a serious burn on his arm. It's always the left side for you, Lu Fang. Just because you only need one hand to jack off doesn't mean the other's useless. Piss off, Lu Fang retorted through gritted teeth, doing his best to grin as the pain was tended to by Katara. I need both hands, not like you, who only need your finger and thumb to get the job done. Poor Ren has to put up with your shit. Wonder how you got her pregnant in the first place. Similar, risque conversations were exchanged between Shing's men and women, with even AZULA joining in at one point. Private, when Kai asked you to take point, he meant to keep a lookout for danger, not run straight into enemy fire like a serving girl looking to make extra pay. Ah, that's too harsh, Your Highness. Those girls are doing it for the money. Jirji's a plain slut for damage. The princess rolled her eyes at the other soldier's remark and glared at the unfortunate private who was still smoking from his charge. If you're really looking to get smashed that bad, wait until after we're done here and keep being useful. After that, you can get reamed until you stop shitting solid for all I care. Sokka and Aang broke down into coughing fits at that, while Katara sputtered with second-hand embarrassment, and Toph innocently asked aloud how'd that work. Shing and his troopers, though, just chuckled and applauded AZULA on her choice of words. Beyond the short breaks, they continued navigating the airship's hallways at a brisk pace, and after a while Sokka noticed that the encounters with enemy resistance petered out. They're likely regrouping, Shing said. Probably in the next large room we'll find, so they can bring their numbers to bear. The prince then turned to Toph with a quizzical look. Can you pick up the enemy movements any better now? She shook her head with mild annoyance. No, there are too many moving parts in this ship, so the vibrations are giving me all sorts of weird images. I can't pick up anything clearly beyond maybe a dozen feet or so. Well, it's better than nothing. It didn't escape Sokka that Toph was enjoying the respect that Shing and his soldiers were giving her. She served as the group's early warning system to pick up on arriving or hidden threats, as well as a most convenient navigation aid by just bending the metal walls and doors in the way to clear a path. As is, they'd already bypassed 4 decks by Toph simply tearing the roof down to create a ramp to the next level, and were now advancing towards the bridge. If not for the steam or water-filled pipes that could spill into the hallways to inconvenience everyone, the Earthbender might have just gone ahead to bend a tunnel straight to their destination already. That big room you mentioned, Toph suddenly commented as they walked on. It's up ahead, and I think it's filled with a lot of people. How a lot is a lot? AZULA queried lightly, staring at the closed door ahead. More than us. Weird furniture arrangement too. Their armory perhaps, one soldier speculated. Or their mess hall, another offered. Shing cut in and pushed his way to the front. Doesn't matter. It's not the bridge, or the Fire Lord's quarters yet. Through the armored bodies in the way, Sokka could barely make out the Scorpion taking a wide-rooted stance. Toph, open up the way, please. My pleasure, the blind bandit answered with a grin, and stomped her foot as her arms lunged out in the direction of the door. A faint wave rippled through the metal surfaces all around them, coalescing onto the doorway. By now, Sokka and the others had already learned to cover their ears. And then, as had happened several times already, a horrific shrieking sound sent everyone cringing as the entire wall housing the doorway was pulled apart like a cloth curtain to reveal a simple canteen. The skull-helmed firebenders on the other side were caught entirely off guard, some bent over with hands over their ears, or the sides of their helmets covering their ears, while others were clearly startled and out of their stances. Unfortunately for them, Shing's boarding party, already accustomed to the experience, were already advancing with flames leading the way. The dragons swooped in with raspy roars, bursting through the sheet of fire to pounce on the nearest royal guards. and with most of the enemy unobstructed and unengaged, Xing quickly slid into a stance to do his ludicrous invisible firebending, and the defenders quickly started screaming as they struggled to take off their sizzling and glowing armor. Even at the back of the group, Sokka and his friends felt the wash of furnace-hot air that sent the wooden tables and benches in the room cracking audibly. No surprise that the 11th overwhelmed the royal guard in no time, and the room's temperature was quickly brought back down to room temperature with a quick flick of Xing's hands. Sokka and the gang didn't hide their relief when they saw that none of the defeated men were killed, only deprived of their armor and quickly bound up. They exited to another hallway after that, and just as they rounded a corner unopposed, Xing, AZULA, and the other soldiers stumbled almost as one. Many looked down at their hands with wide eyes. Do you feel that?" someone remarked with an edge of fear. "We're late," Xing curtly replied in an authoritative tone, placing a gentle hand on AZULA's shoulders to get her attention. "Come, we already expected this. Blades up, soldiers." The 11th rallied quickly, unsheathing axes and short swords and daggers as they hurried onwards. Xing gave a glance over his shoulder towards Aang. "Can you firebend?" The other boy looked down at his own open palms for a second, and then a small flame flickered to life. Aang looked back up at Xing and the few soldiers staring at him. "It's a bit hard, but yeah, good. Now, let's get the Avatar to the fight." They took another turn and shot through a junction unopposed, and with Toph prying the next door open, the boarding party finally came across the bridge. To Sokka's immense relief, amidst the crew and royal guard standing about in confusion, there was a robed man dressed far too gaudily compared to everyone else. The gilded headpiece on him identified him as the Fire Lord, unless someone else was supposed to wear something so ornamental. Interestingly, Ozai did not look as panicked as the men around him were. He was worried, yes, but still exuded a cold, imperious calmness as he glared at their direction. "AZULA, I should have known you'd dash. Shut it, father. Surrender now." The Fire Lord's eyes narrowed with utter contempt that made Sokka scowl. "Foolish child, you're still outnumbered, and I doubt even the vaunted prince." The contemptuous gaze turned to Xing, who didn't react at all. "And his flames are of any use now, are they?" Xing shrugged his shoulders before raising the daggers in his hands. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean I'm helpless. Unlike you and your people." The dragons behind him hissed threateningly, smoke trailing from their snouts. "Plus I have dragons, and they look capable enough." "Fire Lord Ozai," Aang announced, pushing his way to the front and filling his voice with as much authority as he could. "You and your men will surrender." Ozai sneered. "Or what?" Aang was about to reply, but one of the 11th gave a cry and stepped in his way, lashing out with his sword to barely bat an arrow off that would have struck the Avatar right in the head. "Or die," AZULA stated coldly, and that was the signal for both sides to charge at each other. Ozai's royal guard filled the bridge and outnumbered them by a bit, but it was more than balanced out by how fiercely the 11th were fighting. Even at a glance, Sokka could tell that the royal guard, without their firebending, were getting culled. They were like an angry colony of otter penguins trying to swarm a just as angry pack of owl wolves. Some had their ceremonial swords up in time, but it was clear that their skills with the blade were barely up to par with the men and women of the 11th. Still, their numbers were making up for it to some degree, especially after the momentum of the charge on both sides faded. Killing blows were followed by last-minute interventions, and coordinated attacks pushed back some of the 11th's aggression. Xing called out after jamming his blades into an opponent. "Avatar Aang, while the sun's still out." That broke Aang out of his hesitation, and the airbender shot through the air towards Ozai, who managed to keep snarling menacingly as he backed away from the melee. His royal guard tried to stop Aang, but powerful blasts of wind knocked them prone. Those that tried lunging at the Avatar as he sped past them found themselves targeted by Katara and Toph, who utilized their ice and metal to keep Aang's flanks clear. Sokka's gaze was torn away from his friend's pursuit when he spied Kai fighting for his life. The giant of a man expertly fended off two opponents at first, but as a third and fourth joined in, Kai was isolated and surrounded. 3 of his attackers pressed him from the front and sides, and the 4th took the chance to sneak around the lieutenant colonel's back. The man went stiff before he could fully raise his weapon, a black metal blade skewering his armpit and exiting out his neck. Sokka killed his first human at that moment. The realization of what he had done didn't hit him until he glanced up at his gurgling victim and saw the blood dripping from underneath his helmet. And then he noticed more dark blood dribbling down his blade, pooling a little at the handguard. He didn't feel any resistance when he drove his sword through leather and cloth, and human skin and bone. Instincts pushed the shock away, as Sokka quickly slipped his blade free to parry a strike from one of Kai's opponents. A light slap with the flat of his bloody blade knocked the enemy's sword out of the way, and without thinking the Water Tribe warrior lunged in with a stab, his sword clipping the chin of the skull mask and sliding straight into the man's neck. Once more, the back of Sokka's mind noted how he barely felt anything as his sword pierced through armor and flesh. "Thanks," Kai curtly said as he pushed back against his remaining opponents and tore into them with his short sword. Sokka blinked and nodded dumbly, and then saw the enemy trying to harass Toph and Katara. He ignored the shocked look from his sister and darted forwards, plunging himself into the melee and slashing into the backs of the preoccupied enemy. No hesitation, no time for thinking. Grand Aunt Kylan was right. He'll worry about the blood on his hands later. Right now, he had to keep his friends safe. A quick glance at the edge of his vision found Aang casually sending the royal guard flying as they tried to swarm him. Xing and his bodyguard Koshi was with him, keeping the Fire Lord's minions from fully surrounding the Avatar. Sokka was struck by how contrasting the scene of the Avatar and the Scorpion fighting together seemed. Aang was ruffled but otherwise grim and untouched by the enemy. Not even a bruise or a cut landing on him as he floated above his enemies. His bright blue tattoos and orange outfit marked him out clearly from everyone else in this scrum. On the other hand, Xing was a nightmare made real, his red armor darkened and dripping with splotches of blood, and behind the gore-stained chainmail veil Sokka could catch the Scorpion smirking as he ducked and weaved under his opponent's attacks. Sokka was forced to return to the present to intercept a charging foe, bracing his own armored form to knock the man away from Katara. Toph dealt with the matter with a distracted stomp of her foot, causing the metal floor to tear up and wrap around the prone victim. It was more or less she dealt with the royal guards in her sight. The floor, walls, and ceiling came to life to swat and then capture, though with how the claustrophobic battlefield was now pockmarked with holes that threatened to trip both enemies and allies alike. She soon resorted to a more conservative metal bending by yanking out a piece of piping and swinging it like a club at any targets of opportunity. AZULA and Suki pushed ever onwards, blood somehow avoiding the girls' faces even though their weapons and sleeves were heavily stained. The princess formed the anchor that the 11th rallied around as they murdered their way across the bridge. Every step she took brought the boarding party ever closer towards Aang, paved with more corpses of the Fire Lord's followers. Arrows occasionally sung from either side, but Sokka couldn't see if they did anything. A few of Xing's soldiers dragged their wounded fellows out of the melee, depositing bleeding bodies that Katara immediately rushed to tend to. Sokka and a couple of soldiers kept the royal guard from getting close to her and the wounded, while Toph picked up the slack to help keep Aang clear. Not that she needed to carry that burden for too long. With Xing's help in tackling the bodies, Aang managed to reach Ozai. The Fire Lord was sent flying up into the ceiling with a strong gust of wind, and then dropped to the floor with an audible gasp. The fighting was paused when he gave a pained cry as Aang placed a knee on Ozai's neck. "Surrender, Fire Lord Ozai. You're defeated," the downed tyrant growled with defiance, until Xing stepped in front of him, daggers smeared with gore. "Either you surrender as a prisoner of the Avatar, or your fight is with me." By the time the eclipse ended mere minutes later, Fire Lord Ozai and his men were sat by one corner of the bridge, their wrists behind their backs and ankles both bound with strips of metal courtesy of Toph. Cloth torn from the uniform of the dead blindfolded the captives, as the unwounded 11th kept an eye on cooperating bridge crew to bring the airship down. AZULA stood by the bridge's throne rather than sit in it, yanking the speaking tube towards her to carry her voice out the airship's external speaker funnels and into the ears of the masses below the descending vessel. "People of the Fire Nation, Fire Lord Ozai has been defeated by the Avatar and is now our prisoner. As princess of both Ba Sing Se and the Fire Nation, I, Princess AZULA, call on my father's supporters to lay down their arms and surrender, to put an end to the needless suffering. Your cause is lost, but the Avatar will be merciful, unlike me." It took a while for the airship to land, and at Xing and AZULA's insistence, Aang was the first to disembark, followed by the bound and blindfolded Ozai, and only then the boarding party and their prisoners. It was over then. The Fire Nation would be brought to talks as expected, and the long war would be over. Sokka felt some relief at the end of the whole thing. And then he saw Zuko standing by the palace gates, bloodied sword in hand, with the nobles gathered behind him and the soldiers of both armies surrounding the airship, and that relief threatened to melt away. Avatar, the Fire Lord's fate is for the Fire Nation to decide, not you. Hand my father over. Witnessing the invasion from within the city had been an interesting experience, especially from hiding. Zuko, Mai and her family, and the cell of AZULA's agents kept within the tea house throughout most of it. Peeking out the streets, at first it seemed that something infected the city's inhabitants as they cluelessly went on with their day. Whispers that made servants and nobles pause and frown with concern before chattering amongst themselves and spreading their worry to passers-by. And then everyone's heads went up as a shadow swept past the streets. Zuko's hideout was just far enough away that he only needed to crouch by the window to see the familiar air bison flying above the city towards the palace. That sight made the people down on the streets truly worry. Some traders quickly closed up, and servants hastily withdrew from their shopping chores or leisurely walks. By the time a few riders on ostrich horses rode through to tell everyone to seek shelter, the once bustling city blocks were barely half filled, mostly with those stubbornly trying to conduct the last sale or properly close up. Everyone now had good reason to run and lock themselves up in their shops or homes. The domestic forces garrisoning the capital city ran through the now emptied streets, knocking aside carts and trampling abandoned wares. There was no mistaking the fear in them. They knew they were being sent to their doom. The path is now clear. With that sentence from a handmaiden, the prince didn't get to watch the further evolution of the city's desolation. He joined the operatives on the ground floor, watching them don light armor underneath their commoners or courtly attire. Blades and axes were handed out, small shields hidden under robes. Zuko put on the same gear proffered to him by a man in a palace servant's garb, but declined the selection of short swords in favor of his own twin blades. "I should be going with you," Mai complained with arms folded, not for the first time as she glared mildly at him. "Your family needs you." She scowled at that, unable again to counter that simple line. Instead, Mai glared harder at Zuko and muttered, "Don't do anything stupid out there, Private Zuko." The prince smirked despite the dour atmosphere and bowed lightly in reply. "I'll strive to accomplish my mission in one piece, Lady Mai." One of the handmaidens had to ruin the moment. "Look, just kiss already so we can move out." "Your Highness." Zuko gave the woman an annoyed look. "We're just MH. And then his vision was filled with Mai's face, and he felt her hands tugging him by the collar, and he felt her breath wash over his face, and he felt and tasted her lips on his. It lasted a few short seconds before Mai pushed him back. Her usually pale face looked rather fetching with a hint of pink on her cheeks. "Go." Zuko nodded dumbly and followed the agents out. It was easy to distract himself with the lingering sensation on his lips instead of noticing the grins they gave him. Zuko didn't know why, but he unnecessarily resolved himself to make sure to really make it out of all this alive and whole. For Mai, with the soldiers all gone past and not another soul outside, the group scampered through the lifeless streets with minimal caution and maximum haste. The wind carried the softest whispers of explosions and clashing metal, as well as the faintest scent of smoke. They met up with another group of AZULA's infiltrators on the way to the palace, and then two more in the junction after that. Some had their blades and clothing stained with blood and soot. It seemed that with every major road they passed, another group of AZULA's agents would join them, more and more often exchanging silent, grim nods. It had been a culmination of Xing's and AZULA's invasion preparation. Those too incompetent and too far invested with the Fire Lord, often mutually inclusive traits, had to be removed. From what Zuko was briefed, the influential noble and mercantile families had been scouted out days before, and targets of opportunity taken out or intimidated. Today, though, the terms of the new regime were given, and those that hesitated too much would be snuffed out. The more offensive, unlucky prominent courtiers and officials did not get the luxury of getting the chance to switch sides. AZULA was taking the chance to really clean the capital city, and compared to the discussions Zuko overheard back when he was still guarding Mai, she abandoned the options of sweeping away the opposition with exile and disgrace, and opted instead for far more bloody and literal decapitations. The prince didn't try to think too hard on whether only selected nobles would be purged, or their whole families as well. He could see his sister taking either option, even if she held a grudge against the sycophants. Obliterating whole families would minimize threats of vengeful sons and daughters, but the political ramifications would be troublesome for quite a while. But at the same time, effectively crippling and consigning powerful dynasties into insignificance would be a powerful message, at the cost of having to keep an eye on them after that to ensure that they remained insignificant. The pros and cons balanced out rather evenly, and Zuko himself didn't know which option he'd opt for. He was sure he'd find out what AZULA chose immediately once this was all over, though. It'd be a simple matter of seeing how many people attended the first court of the new regime. By the time they came to the palace's gates, a small mob of grim-faced men and women had formed with the prince. Zuko quelled his unease at the swelling number of assassins, knowing that the task ahead would barely paint him in any better light. And then something rumbled from within the palace walls, and that something rose into the air, casting a huge shadow over the city as it got higher and higher. Zuko gaped in shock at the metal impossibility, as did pretty much everyone around him. Whatever it was, the Avatar was diving towards it, which meant that the Fire Lord was likely in there. So much for the symbolic plan of joining forces with the Avatar to take down his father. Zuko shook his head to refocus his attention and marched on to the gates. The shaken palace guards stoically held the line, but they hesitated on acting on seeing the prince at the head of the group. It was impossible for him to keep the pity and pleading from his voice as he addressed the soldiers doing their job. Please stand down. Your lives are far more valuable to the Fire Nation than that of those you're protecting right now. There is nothing to be gained here by standing against us, except our regret and commemoration of you men needlessly sticking to your duty. That got the guards exchanging glances with each other. Trust AZULA's handmaidens to prepare such an impactful speech. Zuko took a step forwards, keeping his sword sheathed as he slightly opened his arms. The rumors you've heard are true. The Fire Lord, my father, did try to kill my uncle Prince Iroh. He banished my sister because she tried to persuade the Avatar to end the war. Thanks to the whisper of corrupt nobles, he's thrown our armies against Xing, who he'd framed for the attempt on my uncle, needlessly wasting Fire Nation lives on both sides of this conflict. He pointed at the metal behemoth floating away from the city. Even now, he abandons the palace and its people. Even as his son, I can't stand aside against such injustice. He took in a slow breath before fixing them with as much royal authority as he could muster. Please, remember your duties to the Fire Nation, not the Fire Lord. The soldiers continued staring at him for a while longer, and then finally lowered their weapons and stood aside. What will you have of us, Prince Zuko? Hiding his relief, Zuko gave them a firm nod before leading AZULA's people in. Please try to convince your colleagues and the palace servants to at least stand aside. Our fight is not with them. Zuko waited for the gate sergeant to nod before nodding at the palace. Are there many of my father's court in there? That got another nod. Thanks to the recent spate of terrorist activity, most of the courtiers have holed up in the palace with their families. Excellent, one of the handmaidens whispered from behind Zuko, and a glance over his shoulder showed not a few faces grinning hungrily. He gave them as strong a glare as he could, and then turned back to the guards. Round them up. We'll give them a chance to renounce their ways and spare their families from complete destruction. That was the most he could do. The courtiers themselves were forfeit, by AZULA's orders, and as distasteful as it was, Zuko had to agree with his sister's decision on a cold and pragmatic level. As they advanced across palace grounds, the sounds of battle could be heard more clearly from behind them. More shadows shot through the air to join the Avatar circling like a fly around the airship. Zuko zoned out all of that. He had his missions, achievable missions, that did not require him to help affect the tides of war or sprout wings and fly. The doors to the throne room was helpfully pushed open by the same guards from the gates, and Zuko led the mob of agents and guards converted to the cause into the Great Hall, finding a congregation of courtiers surrounded by the Fire Lord's own personal guard. It is over, the prince announced. My sister's army has broken into the city and are on their way here. My father has abandoned you here to flee, but is being pursued by the Avatar. Surrender. If not for yourselves, then for your family. The royal guard all fell into fire-bending stances, and someone wanted to protest. But then the afternoon skies darkened, and Zuko felt something off in his body, like his blood circulation somehow numbed. Confusion swept through the courtiers and their protectors, but the princess servants were already drawing their blades. The Black Sun is ascendant. Zuko gave the biggest obstacles to a reformed Fire Nation a glare of finality. Last chance. He did not like the nobles, but he also did not like that he had to slaughter them like this. Some of the royal guards answered by punching their fists out, but not even a flicker of flame was conjured. Zuko sighed and unsheathed his swords. I'm sorry it's come to this. Even before he finished the sentence, the mob behind him had already begun advancing, and then charging into the stunned elite firebenders. Mercifully, it was a short slaughter, but no prisoners were taken. AZULA's wrath was delivered with interest by her servants, who themselves have lost friends and colleagues during the purge that followed after she was forced to flee. The throne room was littered with corpses of once powerful nobles and vaunted personal guards of the Fire Lord, and the last survivor gasped his last right as the day began to brighten again. In the back of the prince's mind, he thought the butchering to be sloppy. Proper soldiers would have herded and surrounded the helpless targets for an easier time, instead of simply engaging them head-on and allowing the rearmost victims to run about as they did. Still, the main objective was accomplished. The palace had fallen. Members of the royal guard were captured in other parts of the palace complex, while families of the courtiers were escorted out to the Grand Plaza. Zuko watched as the new widows and orphans were gathered to be briefed on the fates of their spouses or parents. He hated the cruelty of it all, but he also acknowledged that it could have been worse. AZULA wasn't one for drawing out torment needlessly, and there wasn't any grudge for Shing to get creative. And then they heard AZULA's announcement. Zuko didn't join in the cheers of the soldiers and servants around him, and instead let the relief wash over him for a moment before a new flavor of tension took him. Sighing, Zuko walked out to the palace gates again to greet the arriving rebel army. Generals and their subordinates at the head of bloodstained men and cavalry and tanks stared at him expectantly. The prince drew in a breath to calm himself and delivered the words. My father is not here, but those who whispered poison and encouraged his madness have been brought to justice. The air rang with the susurrations and clangs of leather and metal as the commanders knelt and saluted as one. On behalf of Princess AZULA, General Sho of the 1st Continental Army warmly extends his greetings and gratitude to Prince Zuko. Zuko drew in another breath, doing a very good job at keeping a calm, stony expression. He'd attribute it to Mai's influence, rather than the etiquette tutors. You may enter the palace to secure it, but only on your oath that you do so as loyal servants of the Fire Nation, and not anarchic and ungrateful brutes who are only out for blind vengeance. As you say, Prince Zuko, your royal sister only wishes to right the grievous wrongs dealt by your father and his court. Zuko gave a nod before stepping aside to let the procession march in. Sho and Mosey walked up to him, giving grim but approving nods of their own. Well done, Your Highness. The prince slumped as he finally felt the tension leave him. I did my part, was all he managed to say. Mosey placed a strong hand on Zuko's shoulder. And did it well, Your Highness. I know this choice is a hard one for you, and I cannot imagine what you must be feeling now. He stared straight at the commander. I'm just glad this will be over soon, and new challenges will await, Sho chimed in. Have no doubt that we've pulled the reins of the Fire Nation to keep it from running into destruction. But at the same time, what comes after this will be tough. I know, Zuko sighed heavily. Some cries brought everyone's attention to the skies, where the flying airship was now turning back to the palace. General Sho, Colorado Dash. Hi, General, by the grace of your sister. Hi, General Mosey. Clear the plaza to receive my sister's arrival. Also send out some men to ensure that the city is well and truly ours. Zuko stared up at the descending airship with trepidation. Soon he'll have to deal with his father and the Avatar in front of a crowd. And then he'll have to figure out where he truly fits into AZULA's grand plan. Would it be too late to re-enlist into the 11th? News of Avatar Aang defeating Fire Lord Ozai was quick to spread. That he did so with the help of Shing and AZULA was emphasized, as was the fact that he handed the captured Fire Lord over to Zuko's firm demands only in exchange for negotiations about the war and the changes that the Fire Nation must undergo. The exact contents of the discussion was kept from the public and even the courtiers. Some of its immediate effects were obvious for all to see, though, like Iroh being flown back to the home islands by the Avatar's air bison, which was why he was now standing in the throne room before his niece and nephew, along with the pacified nobility of the Fire Nation, as one of the Fire Sages crowned him the new Fire Lord. "All hail Fire Lord Iroh," someone intoned gravely, and Iroh fought from cringing as the assembled men and women prostrated themselves before him and echoed the words. "Long may the Fire Lord reign," Shing, the cheeky brat, declared from the back of the hall, which got the whole hall chanting along. To Iroh's right, not quite hidden in the shadows, Aang and his friends watched the coronation ceremony in silence. The Avatar wore a frown throughout the whole event, and the new Fire Lord could not blame him. After all, this had all been orchestrated by Shing well beforehand, and it was about the best option to cater to everyone that mattered, whatever Iroh's willingness on the matter. Zuko was still too young, and his years in exile left him ill-experienced for the throne, which was why he was designated as Iroh's heir. Talks of official adoption were still being considered to strengthen the line of succession, but both uncle and nephew were content to kick that topic further down the line for another time. Politics had a way of souring sincere intentions, after all. On the other hand, AZULA gave up all claims on the Fire Nation in exchange for exile to Ba Sing Se with Shing. In that same vein, to allay concerns of the Water Tribes and Earth Kingdom, as well as uphold his own end of this convoluted bargain, the Scorpion Prince was forced to sever his loyalty and duty to the Fire Nation. Ba Sing Se would stand on its own as an independent state, with many restrictions imposed on the diplomatic actions it may or may not conduct with its former suzerain for the near future at least. It would also have its military might curtailed to a purely defensive force, though considering how large the city-state was, even sending out a minimal garrison could be enough to threaten its neighbors, which was why several agreements, ratified with King Bumi, not King K, were put in place to keep a loose leash on the new realm, like having an oversight council made up of representatives from the Water Tribes and Earth Kingdom, again, assigned by Bumi, not K. That half of the council was already filled by the former prisoners of the 11th was considered a non-issue and thus omitted from the records. Of course, all of this was delivered to the masses through the lens of Zuko and AZULA compromising with the Avatar's demands. Beyond reinforcing the Avatar as the ultimate arbiter of balance in the world, it had the benefit of painting the siblings in a positive light for the population of both the Fire Nation and Ba Sing Se, that the discarded son and betrayed daughter did their best to save the Fire Nation from the machinations of what was revealed to be their highly delusional father. But at the same time, the official story would say that the Avatar could not trust AZULA, who had directed Shing up until his conquest of Ba Sing Se. Nor could he so easily forgive Zuko for hounding him. That fabrication too was intended, an unsubtle reason to show his respect of, if not fear, the competence of both prince and princess. It would be a reminder that they were royals who had taken to the field and gotten their hands dirty, unlike their father. And by framing it as Aang being wary of them, the Fire Nation's royal family would salvage some reputation for its subjects to admire, at least until Iroh's rule really began. Hopefully, Zuko got the better end of the public relations work, as Shing had expected and engineered, being a captive prince breaking out to do right by his people, and being uninvolved in the civil war on the Earth continent, and thus having relatively bloodless hands. It was easy for the nobles to flock to him, and the populace to see him as the more benevolent sibling. It mildly disturbed Iroh that his niece would so willingly take on the more villainous role in all this. But after what she's been through, perhaps it shouldn't be so surprising. Me? Fire Lord. Please, uncle. Those who like me and are willing to actually administer properly are already in Ba Sing Se, and trying to rehome them back here would only give me reason to really purge the islands of the split-tongued, incompetent houses. I do not wish to have to constantly rule with an iron fist just to get the job done. Nor do I wish to be a whole world away from my Shing stuck, trying to rebuild a house I've never truly called home, and with the colonies more or less guaranteed to be given up to Bumi. That massive distance between the Fire Islands and Ba Sing Se would be made even more stark. It would be an untenable relation to maintain in the long term. Iroh remembered how AZULA had sniffed with a smug grin after that. Besides, Shing is already feared enough as is. Imagine how many people would be worried enough to turn against us if I took the throne as well. We'd be stuck fending off the shadows for the rest of our lives. That too was true, though perhaps she was taking a bit too much pride in that. Regardless, AZULA all but disowned herself from the royal family, and with Aang making it known that neither she nor Shing would be allowed to set foot on the Fire Islands unless truly warranted, it was entirely their idea. the courtiers of the Fire Nation were given a very good incentive to cooperate with Iroh and Zuko. Already, those who've been clued into the administrative reforms Iroh wished to push through were just waiting for the changes to be brought up so that they may vehemently approve it, disregarding their actual interests that would be affected. The Fire Lord would conveniently leave out the fact that a bulk of the reforms were ideas from AZULA's time as colonial minister, to make it more palatable for the court. With the ceremony over, Iroh regarded his court without the curtain of flame his brother liked so much. It gave him a clearer view of the people he'd have to work with, the new Fire Lord liked to think. Drawing in breath, Iroh said his first words as ruler of the Fire Nation. Let the royal court be in session. And so began the pledges of loyalty from across the islands, and then the progress reports on the return of the armies on the continent, and then the veiled auctioning of recently abandoned estates and holdings, and then the official declaration of the few of Ozai's more dangerous supporters as fugitive traitors. There was so much to deal with, and it was all just internal matters. The matter of negotiations with the Water Tribes and the Omasha-led Earth Kingdom, which held the inevitable reparations and treaties, hadn't been touched yet. At least Shing got the Bumi and the Water Tribe chieftains to hold off on that meeting for a month or 3, mostly so that Iroh would get the chance to publicly approach them first, as a gesture of trying to make amends. But also, it'd give Bumi time to marinate in the prestige of being part of ending the long war and shore up his faction against K. Then, once the two kings, or more realistically Bumi and K's regents, began to really vie for influence, the Fire Nation would seek out Omashu to offer reparations and make things right. That'd shift the balance to Bumi's favor, as various states would no doubt try to get a slice of the pie. That they'd partly be paid with the wealth Shing had looted from Ba Sing Se's palace and noble quarters would be a dark irony for those in the know. Hopefully Bumi wouldn't highlight that to twist the blade against K, it'd have a very real chance of backfiring. A chunk of the remaining reparation payment would be taken from the losing players in the Fire Nation's brief civil war. Beyond losing their family members involved in royal court, noble houses that could not be trusted were stripped of their wealth and would have to rebuild themselves from the ground up. It was either that or the promise of a thorough eradication by AZULA's agents. All in all, the Fire Nation would not lose too much beyond what it has already lost, at the meager and justified cost of a campaign of character assassination of Ozai and his lackeys. That the Avatar could testify to the assassination attempt on Iroh would enhance Iroh's reputation as a peace seeker and reconciler, which would earn some wriggle room on the negotiation table. When he thought about it for too long, Iroh found himself rather terrified of how much Shing and AZULA had taken things into account, even when improvising. With his first court held and done with, Iroh rose up from his throne and approached the gaggle of teens that made him Fire Lord. AZULA was the first to greet him, wearing a smirk. See, Uncle, you're still alive and well. It's not as hard as your reluctance makes it seem. It was too long for my liking, Iroh complained, which got her to shrug. Then add cushions to the throne, or get tea service while you're holding court. It's up to you now to decide how things are run around here. With the nobles thinning out enough, the banter was quickly dropped for more serious matters. So, with no one trying to interrupt the coronation, the Fire Nation is effectively in your hands, Aang said with a smile, and then glanced to Shing. That means we can move on? The Prince of Ba Sing Se nodded. Pre-Fire Lord Iroh is now the fully legitimate ruler of the Fire Nation. If there are any remaining die-hard supporters of Ozai left, they've lost their chance to really make a dent in the regime change. So we don't have to go scouring the islands for hidden cells, Katara said with relief, getting another nod from Shing, not without making Fire Lord Iroh look like he's relying on the Avatar as a crutch. Aang sighed with relief, and his bright smile grew. Well, that's good news all around. Now we just have to wait for the negotiations with the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes to confirm the peace. And don't forget affirming Ba Sing Se's place in the world. Yeah, that too. Zuko broke from his day-long thoughtful silence to fix his gaze between Shing and Aang. So, my father, he'll remain prisoner. The light mood that started to infect the group vanished, and the Scorpion and the Avatar gave firm nods in unison. We'll leave him in the palace dungeons until Sozin's comet, Shing confirmed. What happens after will be entirely dependent on how he, and not his followers, behave. The boy Sokka voiced what had been nagging in the back of Iroh's head. I'm kind of surprised you're not calling for his head or something. It was AZULA who answered with forced lightness. A quick execution would be detrimental to what we're trying to achieve in a new Fire Nation. Personally, I'd like to decide his fate with an Agni Kai. She gave Xing, Zuko, and Iroh a look. But he's still my father, as I've been reminded. We'll give him a chance. His last chance. Thank you, Azula, Iroh sincerely said, bowing his head at his niece's reluctant mercy. She responded by rolling her eyes to hide her clearly conflicted thoughts. Anyway, back to pertinent matters. Is 6 months enough to allow the free movement of people between the Fire Nation and Ba Sing Se? I thought it was 3, Zuko asked. 3 was for the nobles, Azula clarified, so that they'll liquefy and declare all their incoming or outgoing assets in time for the fiscal report. They'll get less wriggle room for any creative corruption. Politics, Aang sighed wearily. Iroh sympathized, wishing he could simply offer the throne to Zuko right now and set up a tea house somewhere peaceful. But like the Avatar, he had to face the realities and responsibilities of his rank. Still, it needn't be such a dour thing all the time. Well, we've been standing about for a while now, Iroh began. Why don't we carry the discussion to the gardens? I'll have the servants prepare us tea. The Fire Lord was stung that it was Zuko of all people who replied with ghastly blasphemy. So long as you don't end up brewing it all by yourself and lecturing them on how to do it correctly, uncle. But how can tea be enjoyed if it's poorly made? The servants need a proper education. You're Fire Lord, not a tea house owner. How quickly the cracks between ruler and heir have shown itself. You know that you've not been officially confirmed as my heir? It was the blind girl Toph that scoffed. What? You're going to adopt and elevate the best tea brewer. You can dabble in the intricacies of tea brewing during your downtime. Iroh. Dabble. Iroh glared at Sokka. Do not belittle the art, boy. To Iroh's chagrin, the youngsters found the exchange amusing as they headed for the gardens. But Xing, the spirit-blessed boy, proved himself the most considerate and wisest of the group by providing Iroh with a satchel of black laogai leaves just as the travesty that was cold leaf water was served, and convinced the others to let Iroh show them how it's done. Ty Lee did not like the fluttering of trepidation that accompanied her in her return to the home islands. She liked far less the fact that the first thing she had to do when stepping foot back home was to meet with AZULA in her old room. Privately, Ty Lee, the princess greeted her with a warm smile, set to a backdrop of contented blues and reds. I'm glad you're here so promptly. There was no snark or hidden context in her words. Ty Lee kept her usual smile up with ease as she bowed. You called and I answered, AZULA. Congratulations for your successes. AZULA gave a single, proud nod before her aura and tone became blunter. Thank you. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get straight to the point for both our sakes. Ty Lee, the other girl couldn't help silently gulping and holding her breath. Would you like to remain here? Ty Lee blinked at the unexpectedly genuine question. This was not the cold banishment she was expecting. I'm sorry. The princess shook her head slightly as she sighed. No, you don't have to be sorry. You've been avoiding me ever since. Ever since that incident. She had, partly out of guilt and shame, partly because she didn't want to face her friend in the midst of processing the tumult in her head. AZULA remained calm and collected as she continued, not a hint of judgment or anger coloring her. We haven't gotten a chance to talk since then. Really talk, but I understand if you do not wish to go over it. I too understand if you find my company to be awkward to be around. Only then did she stiffen visibly, and brownish trepidation began to seep into the edges of her aura. Therefore, I will not begrudge you if you wish to remain on the islands. If you'd like, I could ask for a referral into a theater or circus of your choice. The brittle smile on the princess told Ty Lee that her friend was still being honest. Ty Lee found herself frowning deeply. Is that what she wanted truly? No, obviously not. Despite the distance she'd put between herself and AZULA, Ty Lee still felt attached to her friend, and had found her time in Ba Sing Se to be very much enjoyable. But was it right for her? Was it right for AZULA? Ever since the shock of her impulsive near mistake, Ty Lee had forced herself to look inward and for some soul-searching. It was a confusingly painful process, which was mostly because Ty Lee couldn't see her own aura to offer clues to what she was really feeling. She stared at herself in the mirror for nights, finding nothing but an eerie void in her reflection even as she scowled and sobbed in frustration. She couldn't see her own aura, couldn't see any of the vibrant colors she found in others. It was why she'd been basking in the colors of others all this while. It was why she did her best to craft the lively reactions that brought out the vibrant and pretty colors that she wished for herself. It had been an ingrained habit of Ty Lee, and only recently did she realize that it might not be the best thing. She was becoming too reactionary, too impulsive in chasing the right shades in the auras of the people she interacted with. And breaking her denial of that fact had raised a lot of uncomfortable questions. Did she go along with AZULA's bullying last time because she didn't know any better? Or because she preferred the bright oranges and yellows directed on AZULA's target compared to the angry blacks and red Ty Lee knew she'd face if she tried standing up to the princess? Did she like teasing AZULA and Mai because of the sheepish smiles it elicited and the mutual laughter afterwards? Or because of the pretty shades of pinks it made? Did she talk with Xing's people because she was interested in what they had to say? Or because their auras danced so prettily as they delved into the topics with gusto? Did she try to kiss the princess because there was no questioning about that one? She tried to kiss AZULA only because she didn't like the blacks and grays on her at the time. And Ty Lee just wanted to rid the gloomy aura out of her friend. She'd run out of patience and just wanted the ugly colors gone. Better embarrassment than fear, Ty Lee remembered thinking at the time. It was horrid of her to have focused on that instead of the anxiety AZULA was feeling. That she and Xing reacted very mildly didn't help Ty Lee's guilt in any way. So she took to the task of training that Xing assigned to her with all the focus she could manage, using it as a convenient distraction, away from her roiling thoughts, away from AZULA. Ty Lee. The princess' concerned voice snapped Ty Lee back to the present, where she realized she was gnawing at her bottom lip. AZULA misinterpreted the unconscious action, as she took on a more apologetic expression. You are free to choose as you wish, Ty Lee. You have my word that I will not hold anything against you. The sting of trepidation in her eyes almost made Ty Lee wince. I'd like us to remain friends, but if distance is what you need, no. The denial came out with a strength that surprised both girls. Ty Lee froze for a second, and then hurriedly delved into herself to be certain of the intentions behind her words. It was hard to meet AZULA's quizzical gaze. She wanted to stay. She wanted to remain friends. She wanted to be away with the stupid awkwardness between them. But that would mean trying to explain everything. The other girl took a worried step forward, her aura swirling in a deep blue. Are you all right, Ty Lee? I'm Dash. Ty Lee caught herself from replying instantly, from trying to turn that blue into something brighter. AZULA deserved an honest answer. But how would she answer? How should she answer? The thought of seeing seething black tendrils from AZULA terrified Ty Lee, even more so if it was directed at her. But worse than anger was the possibility that her royal friend might. Ty Lee. She looked straight into her friend's concerned eyes. I'm scared. Ty Lee found herself croaking out through a hitched sob. I'm sorry, AZULA. But I'm scared. AZULA took a step back, an ugly yellow streak shooting across her aura. I'm sorry that No, Ty Lee shook her head vehemently. Please, it's not you, AZULA. I can't. She felt herself being pulled forward as her friend's body pressed tightly against her and comforting arms embraced her. Even with her face half buried in her friend's shoulder, Ty Lee could see that AZULA's deep blue worry was beginning to turn into a mushy gray Spirits, damn it, not now. It took a second before she realized the weird noise was her sobbing into AZULA's shoulder. It's all right, Ty Lee. You don't have to say anything you don't want to, but she needed to. For herself, and for AZULA to know how bad of a person she was. If only she could string the right words together and force it out of her sobs. Ty Lee didn't know how long she lost her composure before she found herself sitting on AZULA's bed, with her friend still soothing her with gentle pats with one hand, and offering the other for Ty Lee to squeeze onto for support. The stab of guilt at seeing the bleak chromatic worry on AZULA's expression overruled Ty Lee's usual mild distaste at such colors. Better. Ty Lee gulped, and then salvaged what resolve she had left to meet AZULA's gaze. I need to explain, AZULA. But I don't know how. It's all right. The princess offered a comforting smile. Relax. Pace yourself. Don't force yourself to make sense. We have time. But shush. Xing's got things handled, and delegation's a thing. Believe me when I say that I've got time, Ty Lee. Even if we have to bring this back to Omni-sensei. There was a sympathy in AZULA that Ty Lee never saw before. Her voice radiated warm oranges like she'd been through the experience before. Assuming you want to go back there anyway, Ty Lee nodded furiously. The princess gave a wan lopsided smirk. Trust me, you'll need to pace yourself. I went through the same thing, back when Xing made me realize some harsh truths. Took us days, on and off, to get everything out, to make everything clear. Being able to voice it and having someone listen helped a lot. AZULA's smirk turned into a wistful smile, which lasted for barely a second before she shook her head and gave Ty Lee a gentler one as she leaned over. Look at me, making it about myself again. I'm sorry, Ty Lee. Let's start slow, all right? Ty Lee gulped as she nodded again and calmed herself by basking in her friend's gentle yellows and cyans before making an attempt at coherency. I just need to dash, she stopped and restarted again. Several times, in fact, each time adjusting the words to make the sentence clearer for AZULA. I need you to know why I tried to kiss you that night. There. The princess frowned slightly and gave a slow nod. It's important for you, Ty Lee, so go ahead. Don't worry. I promise I'll be listening to everything you want to say. And listen she did. AZULA focused intently on Ty Lee's attempt at explaining herself. She didn't have to reiterate several times that it wasn't an excuse, but the girl did so anyway. And her friend patiently took in every word as she promised to, occasionally snapping an arm up to wave away servants peeking in to interrupt. Remarkably, she managed to unload most of it, all the important parts at least, and AZULA remained seated beside her, her face fixed in a mild frown as she digested Ty Lee's muddy stream of words. So, you're trying to move away from your habit of responding for the sake of making the right colors? Yeah, it sounded lame when AZULA put it that way, but she gave a firm nod that somehow turned it into a grave matter. Well then, we'll have to hammer out the details on how to proceed. What? AZULA's eyes narrowed just a fraction. You said you wanted to stay in Omni-sensei? Ty Lee simply nodded. Then we'll have to figure out how to help you break away from your habit. You're not mad. The princess stared at her for a second before huffing. Ty Lee, I'm still trying to make up for my many, many failings as a sister and friend. There's still a lot I need to resolve with Zuko for the many abuses I've dealt to him. My 2 requires a long talk to decide the fate of her father. However, she wants to pretend she doesn't care about him. And then there's the fact that I'll have to figure out how to make it up to both my fiancé and my new Kyoshi warrior friend for essentially pimping out the former so that I could dabble with the latter. What? AZULA rolled her eyes. Long story. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you following the whims of auras is far from the worst thing around, especially when compared to the shit I've done. So no, I can't even begin to be mad. A wry smirk suddenly wormed its way on her features. If anything, I should be thankful that you expanded my horizons. Ty Lee blinked in confusion, but the princess shook her head. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. You want to be more sincere in your expressions. They plotted. Well, AZULA plotted and Ty Lee offered some feedback. Up until evening, and Ty Lee found herself enjoying the moment of semi-normalcy between them. It almost felt like old times, where the princess schemed to inflict pranks on Zuko or some unfortunate tutor, and Ty Lee and Mai would have to listen in to do her bidding. Happy moments, if not happy times. AZULA was right. It felt way better after she had someone listen to her, especially someone who was close like AZULA was. Everything all right? Only when Xing appeared by the door did the girls finally put a pause to their conversation. AZULA got up from the bed to throw her fiancé a smirk. Yeah, just girls talk, that's all. Dinner. The prince wreathed in a halo of contented red confirmed, and then gave Ty Lee a questioning look. She's not leaving, AZULA answered plainly. I misread the situation. Xing smiled, happy on her behalf, and then directed it at Ty Lee. I'm glad you're still willing to stay in Omni-sensei. Well, there's lots of things to do there, she replied half-heartedly, catching herself from making a vapid remark and opting for meeker sincerity. I love Mai, but I've got friends in your city too. I'm sure we can make it so that you're exempt from the movement restrictions, he offered with a sagely nod. Anyway, we can discuss it over dinner. Right then. Come along, Ty Lee. Catching the looks exchanged between prince and princess, Ty Lee suddenly remembered a pertinent tangent to revisit. So, what's this about Xing and Suki? It was a genuine question, one that Ty Lee couldn't help but ask, aura or not. Still, seeing the couple stumble was pleasing, and with the way AZULA coughed, Ty Lee couldn't help but giggle. Perhaps we'll get to that topic after dinner, and the topics related to that. Judging from the speculative looks Ty Lee was receiving from both of them, she found her curiosity significantly piqued. Suki did her best to keep a stoic mask on as she entered the dining hall. Xing and AZULA were already in their seats, along with Tai Li, Mai, Aang and his friends, and Iroh and Zuko. The other bodyguards stood outside, making her the only one in that role to be in the oversized room, or sitting at the huge, round dining table. She did as Xing had suggested and walked at an even pace, acting like she wasn't feeling at all embarrassed or self-conscious as she made for the seat reserved for her. "Ah, Suki, glad of you to join us." AZULA's greeting almost caused Suki's overstrung facade to snap, but she rallied in time. She gave the princess a quick nod before picking up the pace and slipping into the chair right beside Xing. It took an unbelievable amount of willpower for the Kyoshi warrior to keep her head up instead of curling up out of awkwardness. But nobody brought up the obvious, only giving polite greetings, with the worst of it being Katara trying to open a conversation about Kyoshi Island. That Suki could reply without stammering or breaking eye contact was a marvel. That still nobody mentioned anything even more so. By the time the food came, some of Suki's anxiety bled away, and she began to relax. She gladly let the table talk wash over her, hoping to be completely ignored so that she could focus on her meal instead of the impulse to feel her lips again. It was supposed to be just a short conversation with Xing, while AZULA was having a heart-to-heart with Tai Li, one where Suki only felt a little ashamed that she offered no resistance at all when he brought up a potential future for her. It will take some effort in navigating and balancing, but AZULA and I would like to offer you a place within our family. There will be some hierarchy to it, especially on the outside, but I can promise that I'll at least do my part to keep things as fair as I can. Suki understood the dynamics between royalty like them and commoners like herself. Within most of the Earth Kingdom, people like Suki could only hope to be a favored concubine, relegated to a comfortable but severely restricted life within a gilded cage. At worst, they'd be promoted above their station to be their patron's peer, and be forced to fight for their lives against jealous spouses and their lackeys in the battlefield of highborn politics. There's enough sad stories sung and acted out about such things, where the maidens and farmhands involved often ended up dead or starting a new life after faking their deaths, while their noble love interest wailed about their loss for a whole arc. What Xing and AZULA were offering went far beyond being a simple kept woman. The princess had made it clear that she'd like Suki to be actively part of their relationship. Instead of being a powerless concubine, she'd have her own roles and duties, and a say in family matters. She'd be made princess, but with the support of both Xing and AZULA to keep the petty politicking at bay. And as expected from the couple, they had made the relationship politically rational. Suki was a Kyoshi warrior, and even if she left the sisterhood, that reputation would linger. And having a member of that order, former or not, be a member of Boss Sing Se's palace was a big enough deal for AZULA to be offering Suki guarantees about her freedoms on the few times the princess brought the topic up, usually after they spent a quiet moment acclimating with each other's lips. If you want to be cynical about it, the princess had explained on the first night traveling across the sea, having the Avatar work with us really made your presence beside us highly significant. The Kyoshi warriors being an order formed by one and all that. Simply by bringing you into the fold, we gain a measure of legitimacy from the common people of the Earth Kingdom that even a royal marriage between nations might not achieve. Suki remembered AZULA's grin back then. However, for better or worse, we're not so cynical in our intentions. Xing was far less calculative with his proposal. While we'd be glad to have you join us quickly, I understand if you need time to mull it over. Actually, it'd be best if you did take your time thinking it through. This is a big decision, after all. He was being too considerate. Suki already had her answer ready. She already had too many days to mull over the matter ever since the couple brought it up. Too many days of phantom tingling on her lips, as flashes of Xing kissing her distracted her from her normal tasks. And in the end, it was a very simple calculation. Did she like Xing? Yes, very much so. More than just like, especially after having a taste. Did she mind having to work with AZULA beyond mere kissing? Not really, no. And even then, it'd be a very small price to pay to be by Xing's side. So Suki simply gave her answer immediately, though for some reason her body was rigid with trepidation as she delivered a stiff nod. I'd like to be with you. Xing then went on a spiel about whether she was really sure about her answer, that neither he nor AZULA wanted Suki to have regrets. Suki's nerves and patience frayed, and she shut him up by taking a bold step forward to capture his face in her hands and bring her mouth to his. The look of surprise on Xing was satisfying, but not as satisfying as the experience of pressing her lips against his, or how they felt with her probing tongue. "I know what I want, Xing," she told him after she forced herself to break the kiss. "I want you, and I don't mind sharing." His smile turned from polite and accommodating to a kind of delight that made Suki's breath catch in her throat. They kissed again then, this time with Xing brushing her hair back and leaning in slowly. Suki instinctively applied the lessons she learned firsthand from AZULA and worked her lips beyond just opening and closing her mouth or clumsily lashing her tongue out. Xing reciprocated, and Suki lost herself in the giddy moment. At one point, she guided his hand up to her neck, and her prince gave a light squeeze, just the right amount to make her gasp and quiver with pleasure. She shuddered harder when his hand slipped under her dress, and his fingers brushed against her bare skin. Strong hands, not the pincers from her dreams, held on to Suki, and it felt far, far better than what her subconscious had offered. It might have gone further, but then someone had to knock at the door to inform them about dinner. Suki was panting lightly as Xing pulled away and stepped back, wearing a grin on his face that bore both amusement and satisfaction. "We'll continue later." "Why, yeah," she breathed out, and glancing down, noticed the state of disarray her attire was in. "Do you need help?" he cheekily asked, and Suki felt her cheeks warm up as she shook her head. "You can go on ahead," she said with surprising evenness as she started to tidy herself up. "Don't let me keep you from dinner." "My dinner?" Xing asked, amusement dancing in his eyes. "You mean our dinner, right? Since you'll be part of the family now." At her gaping silence, the prince chuckled and began to move for the door. "I'll go check on AZULA. See you at the dining hall," which led Suki to the present, doing her best to eat unobtrusively as she sat to the right of Xing. AZULA was to his left, trading words with Tai Li, Mai and Toph. The new Fire Lord Iroh bantered with Aang, while Zuko beside him engaged Xing and Sokka in conversation. Suki didn't even try to keep up with what was being said by who. She also did her damnedest to not glance Xing's way, as to avoid being drawn to his lips again. The comfortable lack of notice didn't last, though. It was Zuko who, in the midst of replying to Xing, gave Suki a sideways glance, and rather than return to Xing, his eyes lingered for enough seconds that she could feel the puzzlement sprout behind his gaze. "Zuzu, something the matter?" AZULA interrupted in a sweet voice. The prince snapped out of his staring and shook his head, but Suki caught the glance he gave both Xing and AZULA. "Ah, it's nothing. I was just thinking." Regardless, the irregularity had been highlighted, and soon after Iroh was giving Suki a look, which was again interrupted by AZULA. "Yes, dear uncle?" the princess challenged. The Fire Lord frowned a little as he met his niece's gaze. There was a silent question in his look, which was in turn answered in the way AZULA's head shifted vertically ever so slightly. Iroh passed that look to Xing, who shrugged, and then finally sighed with resignation. "It is nothing, AZULA." "Oh, if you say so, uncle." Suki quickly finished her dinner as politely possible, but she couldn't leave fast enough. Katara and Toph were just as quick to corner her in the hallways with worried frowns on their faces. "Suki, are you all right?" the waterbender asked in a cautious half-whisper. Suki stared at the other girl as she fought back a welling embarrassment at the situation. "Xing isn't making you do anything weird, is he?" Spirits, how she wished to curl up out of sight right now. But instead Suki forced herself to answer, highly conscious of how her voice wavered nervously. "He's not. We just, Is it AZULA?" "No, it's not like that." The answer made Katara lean back a little and trade looks with Toph for a second. Then the Beifong girl fixed Suki with a speculative look. "Is it both of them?" She didn't have to answer, because her expression was obvious enough that even the blind earthbender was grinning, and Katara was bringing a shocked hand up to her mouth. "They didn't force you, did they?" Suki shook her head meekly. "It was an offer." "Uh-huh, it's true," Suki asserted, staring at the smaller girl's sightless eyes. "They didn't threaten me or make me do anything. I just..." And then words failed her as she realized what she was about to admit, and Suki had to break eye contact as her cheeks warmed up again. "See, told you it was nothing to worry about, Princess Busybody." "I'm not a busybody," Katara protested. "I was really worried for Suki. Xing and AZULA might be a pain to deal with, but even I know they're not that scummy. Right, Suki?" "Spirits," Why did Toph have to bring the conversation back to her? They're not, Suki confirmed nervously. I mean, they make hard decisions, but they genuinely are good people. So good that a Kyoshi warrior is taking up their offer. Suki felt like her face was burning up out of embarrassment as she nodded. I hope you're not giving up too much, Katara remarked warily, and horrifyingly, Toph's amusement instantly switched to match the girl's concern. I heard stories about how Suki, are the Avatar's friends harassing you? Azula suddenly called out, and the trio turned to find the smirking princess and her equally smirking friends. No, they were just asking questions. Azula's eyebrow went up. We're not harassing her, Katara replied with vehemence initially, but then awkwardness settled in as she grasped the extent of the situation. We just thought that Suki needed some help. But we were wrong. Indeed, the princess walked over to them, her smirk growing sharper with amusement as it was fixed on the Water Tribe girl. I trust you understand enough to not form poorly assumed conclusions? Suki could hear Katara blink. Yeah, good. Azula drew herself up with a soft inhale, and then took on a more formal voice. On our part, know that we've not, and will not force Suki to join us. If you're worried about her well-being, she will not be consigned to be a mere bed warmer. That last line got practically everyone blushing. Azula then smiled as she focused her attention on Suki. I've grown to trust and like Suki as a dear friend, and I would like to retain that friendship. Well, Katara almost stammered, if that's I mean, as long as you know what you're getting into. I am, Suki answered with her rallying resolve. Great then, the princess chimed in with a clap of her hands. Now that the air is cleared, comes Suki, and Azula stepped forwards with a hand brought to Suki's cheek. Suki instinctively parted her lips and tilted her head to receive Azula's kiss, ignoring the embarrassment of having an audience. If anything, the brief contact imparted a comforting warmth for Suki to anchor her nerves around. Azula pulled away smoothly, and her hand slid down to hold Suki's. Xing's waiting for us. We've got to hammer the details of your promotion. Tai Li Mai, I trust you two can find your own entertainment in the meantime. Suki let herself be led off, wishing at the moment that she could ignore the looks she got from the other girls, particularly Katara and Mai. Congrats and all the best, Suki. And Tai Li's cheery, enthusiastic wave was somehow worse.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.